Hey there. Welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers when the world has gone quiet. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows of a man you may not know by face, but whose power shaped an empire. Gustavo Gaviria. To some, he was simply Pablo Escobar's cousin. But to those who knew the truth, he was the lion, the hidden brain of the Medellin Cartel, the architect who built smuggling routes, moved billions, and kept the empire alive, all while staying in the shadows. And then, one night in 1990, he was gone, shot down in Medellin. The lion silenced, the empire left limping. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? It's always wild seeing this little outlaw family stretch across countries and time zones. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. That way, you'll never miss the stories we bring out of the dark. All right, let the noise of the day fade away. Close your eyes if you want, and follow me into the underworld. This is Outlaw Icons. Your sleepy dawn. August 1990. Medellin. The night was heavy with the kind of silence that doesn't last. A silence stretched too thin, waiting to snap. Inside a quiet safe house, hidden in the clutter of the city, a man sat at a table, papers scattered before him, the glow of a dim lamp outlining the calm lines of his face. He wasn't the kind of man who drew attention when he walked into a room. No flashy suits, no loud declarations. He was not Pablo Escobar. He was Gustavo Gaviria, the cousin, the confidant, the strategist, the lion of Medellin. And in a matter of seconds, that silence broke. The thunder of boots, the crash of doors, the shriek of gunfire tearing through wood and concrete. Bullets ripped into walls, tables, and bodies. By the time the echoes settled, Gustavo lay dead, shot down not in the blaze of headlines, but in the dim anonymity of a hidden room. No speeches, no last stand, just blood seeping across the floor, the brain of an empire silenced in an instant. For the men who pulled the triggers, it was a victory. One less name on their list. For Pablo Escobar, it was something else entirely. To lose Gustavo wasn't just losing a cousin. It was losing the one man who kept the machine running when the world seemed set on tearing it apart. It was losing his shadow, his balance, the quiet genius who built the skeleton of the Medellin Cartel. The question lingered in the smoke and the whispers that followed. Had the police really struck down the mind of the operation? And without him, how long could Escobar's empire hold together? To understand that night, we have to step backward, to see not just the fall, but the rise. Because Gustavo Gaviria wasn't the kind of man who stumbled into history. He was deliberate, patient, and cautious, the architect of a criminal empire that reached across continents. Pereira, Colombia, a city smaller than Medellin, quieter, tucked into the coffee-growing heart of the country. That's where Gustavo grew up. The streets were unremarkable, but the bond he formed with his cousin Pablo was anything but. They were family, but more than that, they were partners in crime before crime was even the word for it. Kids chasing opportunities, restless in a place that didn't offer many. Where Pablo dreamed of power and wealth with the intensity of a flame, Gustavo calculated with the coolness of stone. He watched, he measured, and he found the angles. In their early years, the cousins weren't moving cocaine. They were moving contraband. Cigarettes smuggled across borders, appliances brought in without taxes, stolen cars stripped for parts. To most, it looked like petty hustling. To them, it was training. Pablo was the muscle and the ambition. Gustavo was the mind. When Pablo talked about becoming rich, so rich he'd one day be a king, Gustavo never laughed. He leaned in. He asked how. He asked when. The 70s in Colombia were like a fault line shifting beneath everyone's feet. A new drug was rising, one that promised riches beyond imagination. Cocaine. It wasn't the street drug it would later become. It was chic, exotic, the drug of the wealthy in Miami, New York, and beyond. Gustavo understood something crucial early on. Cocaine wasn't just a product, it was a pipeline. Whoever controlled the routes controlled the money. And whoever controlled the money controlled the world. Pablo had the will to push, But Gustavo had the patience to plan. Together, they turned opportunity into empire. Airplanes stuffed with bricks of powder flew low over the Caribbean, dropping their cargo into the waiting hands of smugglers. Boats moved shipments hidden in crates. Every route was mapped, every risk calculated. Gustavo was the one drawing the invisible lines that stretched from the jungles of Colombia to the clubs of Miami. To explain what he did is like explaining the work of an architect who never shows his face on the building. Gustavo didn't need his name on the tower. He needed the foundation to hold. While Escobar courted politicians, built soccer fields, and bought loyalty with spectacle, Gustavo kept the money flowing. He was the treasurer, the accountant, the strategist. If Pablo was the storm, Gustavo was the quiet tide that pulled everything forward. They called him El Leon, the lion, not because he roared, but because he ruled from the shadows. Observant, silent, waiting for the moment to strike. He didn't crave the spotlight. He didn't want his face on newspapers or his name on everyone's lips. That was Pablo's domain. Gustavo wanted efficiency, control, and precision. But even lions must bloody their teeth. The Medellin Cartel was not a corporation in the legal sense. It was an empire built on violence, as much as money. And though Gustavo preferred numbers to bullets, he understood what was required. Rivals disappeared. Traders met their end. Shipments moved not just through calculation, but through fear. Business, in his world, was where disguised as commerce. By the late 70s and into the 80s, billions of dollars flowed through their hands. The cartel's reach was staggering. Imagine trying to launder rivers of money so vast that the banks themselves struggled to contain it. Gustavo mastered it. He funneled cash into Panama, into Switzerland, into the Caribbean. He hid fortunes in properties, companies, even in the ground itself. The cartel buried money in fields and walls, cash wrapped and left to rot. The sheer volume was absurd, but Gustavo's systems kept it moving. Meanwhile, Pablo grew louder. His ambition turned public. He bought his way into Colombia's Congress. He built estates with zoos, hippos, and mansions fit for kings. And with each move into the light, Gustavo pulled further into the shadows. He didn't crave the crown. He wanted the empire to last. He warned Pablo of the dangers, of being too visible, of painting himself as a target too large to miss. But ambition has its own gravity, and Pablo couldn't resist. Soon, violence escalated. Politicians were assassinated, judges killed, journalists silenced. Bombs tore through cities. The war between Escobar and the Colombian state was open and brutal. And through it all, Gustavo worked in the background, trying to hold together a machine that was shaking itself apart. The DEA called him the cartel's financial wizard. Colombian police knew him as the quiet cousin, the one harder to catch, harder to corner. He didn't flaunt his power, but in many ways, he had more of it than Escobar. Money was leverage, and leverage bent nations. But power attracts enemies. By 1989, the U.S. government had declared war on cocaine trafficking. Colombia faced pressure like never before. Escobar responded with terror. Gustavo responded with strategy. He tried to find ways to negotiate, to calm the storm, to keep the empire alive through compromise. Pablo refused. He didn't bend. He declared war on the world. And so the cousins began to drift in their visions, even as they remained bound in blood. Gustavo saw survival in shadows. Pablo saw immortality in fire. The difference would prove fatal. By 1990, the net was tightening. Colombian police, backed by U.S. intelligence, were hunting not just Escobar, but everyone who made the cartel work. And Gustavo was high on that list. They knew killing him would cripple the machine, take away the architect, and the empire would crumble from within. That August night, they found him. Some say it was a tip from rivals. Some whisper it was betrayal from within. Others believe it was sheer persistence, a door knocked one too many times until it finally opened. What's certain is that the raid was swift, brutal, and final. Gustavo Gaviria died not with the roar of a lion, but with the silence of a shadow collapsing. No headlines screamed his name. No statues were raised. To the public, he remained just Escobar's cousin. But to those who knew, his death was the breaking of a spine. And somewhere in the city, Pablo Escobar heard the news. The man who could face down presidents and armies reportedly broke down in grief. To lose Gustavo was to lose his balance, his calm, his strategist. It was the beginning of an unraveling that would end, 2 years later, with Pablo himself hunted across Medellin's rooftops. But that night, as the city's air thickened with whispers, the question that mattered was simple. Had the police really cut out the brain of the Medellin Cartel? And if they had, what would happen now that the empire was running on rage alone? The story of Gustavo Gaviria is not one of loud headlines, but of shadows, of quiet moves that shaped nations, of money that flowed like rivers, of choices that bled into history. He was the cousin, yes, but he was also the lion, and his death was not just the end of man. It was the start of the Medellin Cartel's slow collapse. Yet even in death, his presence lingered. In Pablo's decisions, in the cartel's fading power, in the lessons of ambition without restraint. Gustavo's life was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is not the one everyone sees, but the one no one notices until it's too late. And so the first chapter of this story closes, not with clarity, but with a cliffhanger. Because to truly understand Gustavo Gaviria, to see how a man could be both invisible and indispensable, we have to go back again. To the days when the cousins were boys. To the streets where ambition first took root. To the small hustles that grew into empires. The lion is dead, but his shadow still stretches behind Escobar. And in the chapters ahead, we'll see just how deep those shadows ran. Pereira, Colombia. A city that in the 1950s looked nothing like the sprawling chaos of Medellin. Nestled in the heart of the coffee region, Pereira was quieter, slower, a place where the days smelled of roasted beans and damp mountain air. On its streets, barefoot children kicked balls stitched together from rags. Vendors called out from wooden stalls. Church bells echoed off the hills. It wasn't a city that promised greatness, but for two young boys, it became the soil where ambition would take root. One ambition burning hot, the other calculating and cool. Before the world knew the name Escobar, and before whispers of the lion spread through Medellin, there were just two cousins. Pablo Emilio, restless, always scheming, hungry to climb, and Gustavo de Jesus, observant, reserved, a boy with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything around him. Theirs was not the kind of childhood that foretold kings of cocaine. But beneath the ordinary lay something dangerous. Imagine a street corner in Pereira, late afternoon, the heat pressing down, the dust rising with every shuffle of feet. Pablo is already daring, already reckless. He talks about the future as though it owes him something. He boasts that one day he'll be rich, richer than anyone in Pereira, maybe richer than anyone in Colombia. He says it with a smirk that dares anyone to laugh. Most do, but not Gustavo. He doesn't laugh because he's busy asking how. He listens to the wild dream and starts cutting it into pieces, fitting the parts together like a puzzle. Even as a boy, Gustavo was more engineer than dreamer. Their bond grew in the gaps between family gatherings, church festivals, and games in the street. They weren't just cousins. They were shadows to each other, reflections of two sides of the same restless coin. Pablo's side glittered with reckless fire. Gustavo's side gleamed with steel restraint. When Pablo stole from a schoolmate, Gustavo figured out how to hide it. When Pablo made bets he couldn't pay, Gustavo quietly found ways to balance the scales. They were learning crime before crime even carried weight in their lives, rehearsing for roles they didn't yet know they'd play. By the late 1950s, Colombia was a nation bleeding from a conflict called La Violencia, a civil war between liberals and conservatives that had left towns in ruins and families torn apart. Pereira, though spared some of the worst violence, still carried its shadows. Violence hung in the air like humidity. Children grew up not wondering whether blood would spill, but when and where. In that kind of world, ambition didn't bloom into polite professions. It twisted into survival, into hunger, into the will to take what the world wouldn't give. It was here that Pablo and Gustavo began testing themselves against the limits of law. Not grand crimes yet, just petty hustles. Cigarettes smuggled across borders, easy to sell for quick cash. Stolen car parts, stripped down and resold. Radios carried from one town to another without the weight of taxes. To outsiders, they looked like street punks dabbling. To the cousins, it was an education. Pablo played the bold salesman, Gustavo the bookkeeper who made sure profit stayed in their pockets. One without the other would have burned out quickly. Together, they learned balance. Pablo dreamed of castles in the clouds. Gustavo wanted to make sure the foundations didn't crack. That contrast became the axis of their partnership. Even as boys, Gustavo was quieter, less likely to brag, more likely to disappear into the background. But those who watched closely knew he was the one doing the math. He was the one making sure Pablo's chaos left something standing. The people around them saw only cousins playing. But beneath that mask, the bond tightened. Gustavo was fiercely loyal to family, and Pablo was family above all. He may not have shared Pablo's fire for being noticed, but he understood its power. He knew how to harness it, shape it, and direct it. It was a lesson learned in whispers, in long conversations beneath flickering streetlights, in a laughter of boys who dreamed of more than the coffee fields and brick houses surrounding them. But childhood innocence doesn't last long in a country cracked by inequality. In Pereira, the rich lived in sprawling fincas, sipping coffee from china cups, their children educated in foreign schools. The poor bent their backs in the fields, sweating for wages that barely filled their plates. Pablo saw that division and seethed. Gustavo saw it too, but instead of rage, he studied it. He watched how money moved. He noticed how respect clung to those with power, how fear followed those who held it. He didn't hate the game. He wanted to master it. There is a story whispered among those who knew them young. Pablo once declared, with the arrogance of a teenager, that he would one day be president of Colombia. The others laughed until their sides hurt. Gustavo didn't. He didn't believe Pablo would be president, but he did believe Pablo could climb higher than anyone imagined. And in that quiet belief, he positioned himself as the shadow behind the throne. Think of Gustavo as the chess player who never moved the queen himself. He studied the board, calculated the outcomes, and whispered the strategy to the hand that held the piece. Pablo liked being the piece everyone watched. Gustavo liked being the one no one noticed until the checkmate fell. As the 60s began, their bond deepened into partnership. Small crimes turned into organized hustles. Pablo brought the boldness, Gustavo the structure. Their relationship became a rhythm. Pablo pushed forward. Gustavo pulled back just enough to steady the balance. Like fire and water, they should have extinguished each other. Instead, they fused into something stronger. Family reinforced that connection. In Colombia, family is more than blood. It is loyalty, protection, obligation. Gustavo saw himself not just as Pablo's cousin, but as his shield, his compass. And Pablo, despite his bravado, relied on Gustavo in ways few understood. Behind every risk Pablo took, Gustavo was there, recalculating, patching holes, creating systems that made chaos look like design. But shadows don't stay shadows forever. As their schemes grew, so too did the risks. Each contraband run, each stolen car, each border crossed carried the weight of possibility, fortune or prison. Pablo thrived on the gamble. Gustavo feared wasted opportunity more than punishment. That difference shaped their choices. Pablo might have walked away from crime had he failed often enough. Gustavo ensured failure was rare. This is how their childhood in Pereira became the forge of their empire. What began as small hustles hardened into discipline, into roles they would carry for the rest of their lives. Pablo as the storm, Gustavo as the tide, one drawing all the attention, the other pulling everything into place beneath the surface. And yet, beneath the partnership, there were cracks waiting to spread. Pablo's hunger grew insatiable. Gustavo's caution sometimes pulled against it. He warned, he advised, he calculated. But already the seeds of tension were planted. How do you restrain a man who believes the world belongs to him? How do you anchor a cousin who sees restraint as weakness? In Pereira, no one could answer those questions. To most, they were still boys from ordinary families. But in reality, they were already writing the first chapters of a story that would engulf Colombia, the United States, and far beyond. As teenagers, they stood on the edge of a future no one around them could predict. They didn't know cocaine yet. They didn't know the billions, the wars, the blood. What they knew was each other. Pablo's eyes burned with ambition. Gustavo's eyes calculated risk. And together, they walked streets that smelled of roasted coffee, dreaming of empires that would one day choke the world. It is tempting to imagine their bond as unbreakable, as though family and loyalty were armor strong enough to withstand the coming storms. But history teaches otherwise. Bonds bend under weight. Loyalties snap when tested by ambition and fear. In Pereira, the cousins didn't yet feel that strain. They only felt the thrill of possibility. And yet, even in their laughter, the question lingered, silent and sharp. If one day they rose higher than anyone thought possible, which of them would truly be in control? The boy with fire in his veins? Or the boy who ruled from the shadows? The answer would define the future of the Medellin Cartel. But in Pereira, it was still hidden, waiting in the wings, like a shadow stretched just beyond the reach of the sun. Blood is thicker than water. In Colombia, that isn't just a proverb whispered over kitchen tables. It's the cornerstone of survival. When the state fails, when the law cannot be trusted, when betrayal lurks in every shadow, family becomes the one currency that doesn't lose its value. For Pablo Escobar, there was one person he trusted more than any politician he bribed, more than any sicario who swore loyalty, more than any mistress who whispered in the dark. That person was his cousin, Gustavo Gaviria. Theirs was not just a connection of bloodlines. It was a bond forged in childhood, in the dust and narrow streets of Pereira, and hardened by years of petty hustles that became empires. If Pablo was fire, Gustavo was the stone that contained it. If Pablo dreamed of crowns, Gustavo built the throne beneath him. Escobar may have been the face of the Medellin Cartel, but it was Gustavo who became the spine. And without the spine, the body doesn't stand. Picture the two cousins in their teenage years, sitting side by side on a crumbling wall as the sun bleeds over the horizon. Pablo talks fast, hands flying, already mapping out a future no one else can see. He speaks of riches, of power, of one day ruling Colombia not through politics but through fear and money. Gustavo listens, calm, the way a chess player studies the board while his opponent rattles off moves in excitement. He doesn't dismiss Pablo. He doesn't mock him. He studies him, then says, quietly, "It can be done." That simple faith was something Pablo never forgot. In a world where most laughed at his ambitions, Gustavo leaned in. And that leaning was everything. Because even visionaries need someone to keep their feet from slipping on the climb. Family in Colombia isn't just loyalty, it's insulation. Blood ties are harder to break, harder to infiltrate. Gustavo became Pablo's circle within the circle. Business partners could betray. Hired killers could be bought. But blood? That was different. That was sacred. And in the shadow of Escobar's rise, Gustavo carried that sacred bond like armor. As they grew older, their roles crystallized. Pablo thrived on being the loud one, the showman who dared the world to look away. He loved to be recognized, loved the thrill of his name whispered in fear. Gustavo was the opposite. He preferred anonymity, preferred the shadows where no spotlight could burn him. He didn't want fame. He wanted security. The division was natural, almost instinctive. Pablo became the face, Gustavo the foundation. In the early years of their smuggling operations, this trust was tested. Contraband moved across borders, cigarettes slipped past customs, and cars disappeared in the night. Every move required risk, and every risk demanded someone who could be trusted not to fold under pressure. Gustavo was that someone. Where other partners wavered or fell away, Gustavo stood steady. Pablo began to realize that his cousin wasn't just useful, he was indispensable. Imagine a scale. On one side, Pablo's ambition, heavy and wild, constantly threatening to tip into chaos. On the other, Gustavo's caution, his meticulous nature, his ability to balance risk with reward. Without Gustavo, the scale collapsed. With him, it balanced, just enough for Pablo to climb higher and higher. Family gave that balance weight. Gustavo wasn't just protecting profit. He was protecting blood. For Pablo, knowing his cousin was by his side meant he could take greater leaps. He could walk into dangerous deals, confront violent rivals, and build alliances that might have swallowed another man whole. Because in the background, Gustavo was there, steadying the ground beneath his feet. But loyalty cuts both ways. Gustavo's trust in Pablo was not blind. He knew his cousin's hunger could become destructive. He knew the risks of fire. But he also knew that no one else had the willpower to reshape Colombia's underworld. So he stayed close, both shield and anchor, hoping his presence would keep Pablo from burning too bright, too fast. It is said that Escobar once told his inner circle that if everyone else betrayed him, if the entire cartel collapsed, he would still have Gustavo. That was the weight of their bond. Not friendship, not convenience. Blood. A connection that could not be bought, bribed, or broken by fear. In the late 1960s, when their hustles were still small, Gustavo proved his worth again and again. He was the one who counted the money, checked the weight of shipments, ensured every detail lined up. Pablo was reckless, too reckless sometimes, but Gustavo's presence meant mistakes were covered, problems smoothed over. One without the other might have ended in prison or death before their empire even began. Together, they thrived. Think of them as two gears in a machine. Pablo's gear turned fast, grinding forward with energy and force. Gustavo's gear turned slow, measured, steady. Alone, each would spin uselessly. Together, they drove the engine of the Medellin Cartel. And that engine would soon become unstoppable. But family loyalty was more than just practical. It was emotional. Gustavo saw Pablo not just as a cousin, but as a brother. He knew the boy who dreamed of castles, who smirked when adults scolded him, who refused to accept the life laid out before him. That intimacy created trust no outsider could ever replicate. And in a world where betrayal lurked in every shadow, that intimacy was priceless. Escobar, for all his ruthlessness, was not a man without feelings. He had a soft core, hidden beneath layers of violence and arrogance. Gustavo touched that core. When they sat together, speaking of plans or family, Escobar listened. He didn't always agree. Ambition made him stubborn, but he listened. He considered Gustavo's words in ways he rarely considered anyone else's. That trust became their greatest strength, but it also planted the seed of tragedy. Because if Pablo was unstoppable with Gustavo by his side, what would happen if the lion was ever silenced? What happens when the foundation crumbles beneath the crown? The Medellin Cartel would rise on the strength of this bond, and it would fall when the bond was broken. But in these early years, no one could imagine such an end. The cousins seemed untouchable. One visible, one invisible. One feared, one calculating. Together, they were family-made empire. As the 60s turned to 70s, the world around them shifted. Cocaine entered the scene, promising riches beyond anything their small hustles could offer. Pablo saw the glow of gold. Gustavo saw the structure beneath it, the logistics, the routes, the money trails that could either drown them or make them kings. And so the cousins stepped together into a game that would transform them from smugglers into legends. But legends always carry shadows. And no matter how strong the bond of family, shadows have a way of stretching into places you can't control. The cousins walked hand in hand toward a future that promised both unimaginable riches and inevitable blood. The foundation of that empire was family loyalty. But loyalty, like stone, cracks under enough pressure. And as they prepared to enter the cocaine trade, the question lingered in the background, silent and sharp. Could even family loyalty survive the weight of billions? Every empire begins in the shadows. Before there were mansions, before there were billions hidden in the walls of farms and the vaults of Panama banks, there were only two cousins, hustling through the cracks of a fragile nation. And it was in those cracks that they first learned the rules of power, rules that had nothing to do with politics or law, and everything to do with risk, cunning, and loyalty. The world remembers Pablo Escobar as the man who turned cocaine into gold. But the path to that point was paved with smaller games, dirtier hustles, moves so small that most people overlook them. To understand how Gustavo Gaviria became the architect of smuggling routes, you have to look at the years when their crimes were still measured not in tons, but in cartons, engines, and radios. Picture Colombia in the late 1960s, a nation trying to rebuild from decades of violence, but still riddled with corruption, poverty, and opportunity for those bold enough to take it. Smuggling wasn't rare. It was survival. Borders leaked like sieves, and officials looked the other way if their palms were greased. Into this world stepped two young men from Pereira, carrying ambition larger than their years. Their early game was cigarettes, not the kind sold in shops, taxed and tracked, but contraband cartons slipped into Colombia through back doors. To most, it was a hustle barely worth a risk. But to Pablo and Gustavo, it was training. Pablo was the salesman, standing on corners, flashing that cocky smile, convincing anyone with pesos in their pocket that he had the better deal. Gustavo was the accountant, weighing cost against profit, making sure their little empire didn't collapse under carelessness. If contraband cigarettes were the classroom, stolen cars became the graduation exam. Pablo loved the rush, boosting vehicles, stripping them for parts, reselling what he could. But where Pablo saw adrenaline, Gustavo saw systems. He mapped out where the car should be sold, how to hide the trail, how to make sure police looked in the wrong direction. One cousin played with fire. The other contained it, directing the flames where they burned most profitably. Then came the radios, televisions, and appliances, goods smuggled across borders without paying the heavy tariffs. In Colombia, those taxes turned ordinary products into luxuries. By slipping them in untaxed, the cousins could undercut the market and still pocket serious money. Pablo bragged about how much they'd make. Gustavo kept the books. He treated every deal as though it were a rehearsal for something larger, something not yet visible but inevitable. The truth is, these early crimes weren't glamorous. They weren't the stuff of future documentaries, but they were the forge. Each hustle taught them not just how to make money, but how to think like criminals who wanted more than scraps. They learned which officials could be bribed, which routes were safest, how to blend into the noise of daily commerce. And in each lesson, their differences showed. Pablo chased volume and speed. Gustavo chased precision. One night, after a successful run of moving contraband appliances, Pablo sat back with a grin, pocketing his share of the profit. He joked about the day he would live like a king. His name feared across Colombia. Most men laughed at dreams that big. But Gustavo didn't laugh. He simply asked, "How do we get there without being caught?" That was Gustavo's way, always asking not whether something could be done, but how it could be sustained. It was a contrast that defined them. Pablo had the instinct of a gambler, rolling dice with fate and reveling when they landed in his favor. Gustavo had the mind of a banker, calculating odds, ensuring the house, their house, always won. Together, they made the perfect equation. The risks grew as their operations expanded. They bribed customs officials to wave through shipments. They forged documents. They learned how to disguise goods, how to stash contraband in places no inspector would bother to look. Each move brought them more money, but also more danger. And with danger came lessons about loyalty, betrayal, and violence. Partners who skimmed off the top disappeared. Enforcers were brought in, men willing to bloody their hands so the cousins didn't have to, at least not yet. Still, Gustavo stayed mostly invisible. While Pablo strutted with his small-time reputation, Gustavo remained in the background, the quiet one. But those who paid attention saw the truth. The quiet one was the reason they weren't in prison. The quiet one was the reason the money didn't vanish. The quiet one was already the lion, not roaring, but watching, calculating, waiting. Every criminal empire has a tipping point, a moment when hustles stop being hustles and become the blueprint for something far greater. For Pablo and Gustavo, that moment was fast approaching. In the background, whispers of a new drug were spreading. Cocaine, white powder from Peru and Bolivia, just beginning to trickle into the United States, where it was seen not as poison, but as luxury. A party drug for the rich, a powder more profitable, pound for pound, than anything else on earth. In the late nights of Pereira and Medellin, Pablo began to talk about this new game. The money, he said, was endless. 1 kilo could bring in enough profit to buy a house. 10 kilos could buy a neighborhood. 100 could buy influence. It was fantasy talk, the kind of thing that would have made most men laugh. But Gustavo didn't laugh. He studied the numbers, listened to the whispers, watched the way demand was rising in Miami. And then he said, with his usual calm, "If it's true, we should control the routes before anyone else does." It was the kind of statement that changed history. Because Pablo saw the gold, but Gustavo saw the map. He understood that drugs weren't just about supply, they were about logistics. Who could move the product fastest, safest, and most efficiently? Who could build the networks, bribe the right officials, keep the machine running without collapse? That was Gustavo's territory. And it was a territory he was ready to claim. But in these early years, before cocaine crowned them kings, the cousins were still just men in the game. Cigarettes, radios, stolen cars. Each deal carried risk. Each deal deepened their partnership. Each deal built trust. Pablo may have dreamed louder, but Gustavo's silence was what made those dreams possible. In the dim corners of Colombia's underworld, their names began to circulate, not as legends yet, but as men to watch. Men who understood not just how to hustle, but how to grow. Men who could turn small games into big ones. And so, by the dawn of the 1970s, the cousins stood at the edge of transformation. The contraband years had given them experience, money, and confidence. But more importantly, it had given them clarity about who they were. Pablo, the storm. Gustavo, the architect. One reckless, one cautious. One loud, one silent. Together, they were already building an empire, even if they didn't yet know what kind of empire it would be. But whispers were growing louder. A new product, a new market, a new chance at power, so immense it would reshape Colombia forever. The world of cigarettes and radios was fading. The world of cocaine was calling. And the cousins were ready to answer. Still, a question lingered, heavy as smoke in the air. If they entered this new game, if they embraced cocaine fully, could they keep control? Could Gustavo's cool logic contain Pablo's reckless daring when the stakes weren't thousands, but billions? Could family loyalty withstand the weight of a fortune larger than some nations' treasuries? The answer was waiting in the white powder that would soon flow like rivers across borders. And once they stepped into that world, there would be no turning back. By the early 1970s, the cousins were no longer boys chasing small hustles in the alleys of Pereira. They had outgrown contraband cigarettes, stolen cars, and smuggled radios. Those games had given them money, experience, and connections. But the world was shifting, and whispers of a new fortune drifted through the underworld like smoke from hidden fire. A powder, white, fine, and potent. Cocaine. In Colombia, coca leaves have been chewed for centuries, a tradition as old as the mountains themselves. But what filtered down into the cities was no longer tradition. It was transformation, processed into cocaine hydrochloride. It was light, easy to transport, and explosively profitable. In the United States, it was still exotic, the drug of nightclubs, celebrities, Wall Street brokers. A gram that cost pennies to produce in Colombia could fetch small fortunes in Miami or New York. Pablo saw gold. Gustavo saw blueprints. One cousin dreamed of mountains of money. The other studied how to move it. Together, they realized the future. Cigarettes and stolen cars were crumbs compared to what this new empire promised. The first shipments were small, carried through back doors and secret compartments, barely more than experiments. A kilo here, a few kilos there, enough to test the waters, to learn how customs worked, to learn which officials could be bribed and which ports were safest. The profits were staggering. A single kilo smuggled into Miami brought back more than entire truckloads of contraband goods. For men who had always thought in hustles, it was like discovering a river of gold flowing under their feet. Gustavo immediately grasped what cocaine meant. It wasn't just about selling product. It was about creating a system. Cocaine didn't move itself. It required planes, pilots, safe houses, accountants, money launderers, lawyers, bankers. It required routes through jungles and oceans, hidden compartments in planes, landing strips carved into forests. It was not a hustle anymore. It was logistics. And logistics was Gustavo's kingdom. Pablo, with his hunger and boldness, began forging connections with producers, farmers, and chemists who processed the leaves. He leaned on his charisma, his threats, his iron will. Gustavo, quieter, calmer, started building the channels that would make the trade sustainable. It was Gustavo who thought about how to launder the cash through banks in Panama. It was Gustavo who studied how to set up companies as fronts, how to move shipments without drawing attention. One night, after a particularly successful run, Pablo laughed about the sheer volume of money they were making. "We'll be kings," he boasted, raising a glass. But Gustavo only stared at the bundles of cash stacked against the walls. "Kings," he said softly, "don't last unless they build castles. And castles need foundations." To Gustavo, cocaine was the future, but only if they mastered the hidden architecture that kept empires standing. The cousins began scaling quickly. Airplanes were bought, small, fast planes that could dip low over the Caribbean, hugging the waves to avoid radar, before landing on hidden strips in the Bahamas or Florida. Boats carried loads across waters disguised among legitimate cargo. Couriers, paid handsomely, flew into the United States with cocaine hidden in suitcases, sometimes strapped to their bodies. Each risk was terrifying, but the money justified it. For every shipment that slipped through, their profits multiplied. Within a few years, their fortune had grown beyond imagination. But with fortune came exposure. The more cocaine they moved, the more eyes turned toward them. Police, rival smugglers, foreign governments. It was Gustavo who reminded Pablo constantly, the bigger the fire, the more smoke it gives off. And smoke always draws hunters. Still, neither man could turn away. The cocaine business was not just profitable. It was intoxicating. And unlike contraband cigarettes or stolen cars, cocaine offered something new: power. With money came influence. With influence came the ability to bend entire systems. They could bribe judges, buy police commanders, pay off customs officials. Entire neighborhoods began to see them not as criminals, but as providers, benefactors. It was the beginning of what would later be called narcopolitics, the blending of crime and governance until the line vanished. For Gustavo, the cocaine era meant responsibility. His mind sharpened around the logistics: how to keep cash moving, how to reinvest profits, how to protect shipments. He became obsessed with efficiency, turning smuggling into something closer to industry than crime. Where Pablo loved to play the king, Gustavo loved to play the architect. And the Medellin Cartel, though it was not yet fully formed, began to resemble a corporation more than a gang. But corporations can collapse, and Gustavo knew it. He saw danger not in rivals alone, but in Pablo himself. His cousin's hunger for recognition was growing. Pablo loved being feared, loved being whispered about. He wanted to be a name not just in Medellin, but in Bogotá, in Washington, in the world. Gustavo, by contrast, preferred to disappear, to stay invisible, to build in silence. Their bond remained unbroken, but their visions began to diverge. The cocaine trade was exploding. The United States was consuming it faster than it could be supplied. Demand outpaced production, and the cousins were perfectly positioned to fill the gap. They expanded their operations, moving from kilos to hundreds of kilos, and soon, tons. The money poured in so fast they couldn't launder it quickly enough. They buried cash in walls, in fields, and barrels underground. It was absurd, and yet it was only the beginning. In the shadows, Gustavo's mind worked constantly. He devised new routes, new hiding places, new ways to confuse investigators. He studied the weak points in borders, in airports, in customs systems. He turned the flow of cocaine into something almost unstoppable. But he also felt the weight of what they were building. The bigger the empire, the greater the fall when it came. By the mid-70s, the cousins were no longer smugglers. They were businessmen of death and addiction, though few in Colombia saw it that way. To their communities, they were benefactors, men who spent money on soccer fields, homes, and churches. Pablo embraced this role publicly. Gustavo let him. Gustavo understood that a public face was useful, but he refused to become one himself. He was content to remain invisible, the lion whose roar was silence. Yet invisibility has its price. Those who watched only saw Pablo. The name Escobar began to rise, whispered in Miami clubs, cursed in U.S. government offices, celebrated in Medellin barrios. Gustavo's name rarely surfaced. But inside the cartel, everyone knew the truth, the money, the logistics, the very structure of the empire. That was Gustavo. Without him, the machine would grind to a halt. And so, as the 70s bled into the 80s, the cocaine empire grew. What had started as small runs of contraband had transformed into an industrial-scale operation worth billions. The Medellin Cartel was taking shape, though it didn't yet have a name. And at its heart were two cousins, one the storm, the other the architect. But empires built on powder are empires built on quicksand. The more they expanded, the more the ground beneath them shifted. Rivals were watching. Governments were beginning to take notice. And Pablo's hunger for recognition was becoming dangerous. Gustavo warned him again and again. The shadows are safer than the spotlight. But Pablo never listened. The rise of cocaine had given them everything: wealth, power, influence. But it had also set them on a path that could only end in blood. And as shipments multiplied and fortunes grew, one question began to haunt Gustavo. Could he keep the empire alive when its most visible king insisted on drawing every eye, every hunter, every enemy toward them? That question would define the years to come. Because cocaine didn't just make them rich. It made them targets. And the bigger the lion's shadow, the more hunters waited beyond the firelight. By the mid-70s, cocaine was no longer a rumor whispered in clubs. It was a tidal wave, crashing into the shores of Miami and New York, flooding streets, reshaping economies, and rewriting the rules of crime. And behind that wave stood men who understood not just how to supply it, but how to build the pipelines that kept it flowing. At the center of those men was Gustavo Gaviria. If Pablo Escobar was the face of the Medellin Empire, Gustavo was the nervous system, unseen, silent, but keeping everything alive. Where others saw drugs and cash, Gustavo saw routes, maps, and systems. He was less interested in the sparkle of the gold than in the gears of the machine. And those gears would become the smuggling routes that turned the Medellin Cartel into a global power. Imagine for a moment what cocaine meant in raw numbers. A single kilo worth pennies in the jungles of Colombia could fetch tens of thousands in Miami. Multiply that by hundreds, then by thousands. Soon, it wasn't just profit. It was an avalanche of wealth. But avalanches can bury the careless. To move that much product required something more than ambition. It required design. That design was Gustavo's genius. He built an invisible network, a circulatory system stretching from Colombian jungles to U.S. cities, weaving through oceans, islands, and skies. Plains became arteries. Boats became veins. Safe houses became the capillaries where product and cash pulsed through. It was less a cartel and more a body, and Gustavo was its architect. The planes came first. Small, agile aircraft that could hug the sea, skimming so low they slipped beneath radar. Pilots trained to land on dirt strips carved into jungles or islands, delivering loads that weighed more than the planes themselves should carry. Gustavo coordinated it all: where they took off, where they landed, how they refueled. He calculated the fuel loads, the distances, the risks of interception. To him, It was less about daring and more about precision. Then came the boats. Fishing vessels with false bottoms, cargo ships hiding cocaine among legitimate goods, speedboats built for sprints across Caribbean waters. Boats could carry more, but they were slower, more vulnerable. Gustavo compensated by diversifying. Never one route, never one method. Like a chess master, he moved pieces in patterns so complex no opponent could predict them all. If one shipment was lost, 3 others landed. And then there were the safe houses, quiet homes scattered across Miami, New York, Panama City. Each one a node in the network, staffed with trusted men who stored, cut, repackaged, and redistributed the cocaine. Cash flowed back through the same routes, bundled and laundered, carried into banks that pretended not to notice the weight of the deposits. For money laundering, Gustavo turned to Panama. The banks there, eager for deposits, asked few questions. Shell companies have sprouted overnight, fronts that made dirty billions look like clean business profits. From Panama, money slipped into the Caymans, into Switzerland, into accounts that could be accessed anywhere. It was financial engineering on a global scale, decades ahead of its time. What made Gustavo different was his invisibility. Other traffickers boasted about their planes, their yachts, their luxury. Gustavo never did. He stayed off the radar, his name barely known outside law enforcement and cartel circles. While Pablo loved the theater of power, Gustavo preferred the silence of efficiency. And efficiency was what made the Medellin Cartel nearly unstoppable in its prime. To understand his genius, imagine smuggling not as crime, but as supply chain management. In the legal world, companies like Coca-Cola or Ford build networks to move goods across borders. They rely on shipping, storage, distribution. Gustavo did the same, but his product was illegal, his risk absolute. If Coca-Cola loses a shipment, it files insurance. If Gustavo lost one, men died. Mistakes weren't measured in money alone. They were measured in blood. So Gustavo minimized mistakes. He rotated routes constantly, ensuring no pattern stayed predictable. He bribed officials not once, but repeatedly, layering payments so deep that entire branches of customs seemed blind to his cargo. He thought of everything: backup pilots, emergency landing strips, duplicate routes. To him, smuggling was not just business. It was war, and logistics was his weapon. Inside the cartel, men began to call him El Leon, the lion, not because he roared, but because he commanded, quietly, firmly, always with control. He didn't scream orders. He didn't need to. His calm was authority enough. And yet, even as he perfected these routes, he knew each shipment was a gamble. The Americans were waking up. DEA agents in Miami were scrambling, trying to piece together the puzzle. Coast Guard cutters prowled the Caribbean. Customs officers sharpened their inspections. But for every move the Americans made, Gustavo countered. He played cat and mouse across oceans, always staying one step ahead. In the late 70s, one of their planes crashed in the Bahamas, spilling cocaine across a field. The Americans celebrated, newspapers reported the bust, and politicians declared victory. But what they didn't know was that 3 other planes had landed safely that week, each carrying loads 10 times larger. For Gustavo, the loss was acceptable. He built redundancy into the system. He never relied on luck. He relied on math. Still, the risks multiplied. Rivals circled. The Cali cartel was rising, competitors with their own smuggling empires, their own ambitions. To survive, Gustavo doubled down on efficiency. He made sure their routes were not just profitable, but protected. Sicarios guarded shipments. Informants monitored police movements. Entire communities were paid to keep quiet. The network wasn't just physical, it was social, a web of silence and complicity. And through it all, Gustavo remained hidden. If you asked the average Colombian in those years who ran the cocaine trade, they would say Pablo Escobar. They would picture his face, his mustache, his flamboyant lifestyle. Few would mention Gustavo. But inside the empire, the men who counted the money, who flew the planes, who moved the boats, they all knew. Without Gustavo, the machine collapsed. The irony is striking. Pablo Escobar became the most famous drug lord in history, his name synonymous with cocaine. But the system that made him rich, the architecture that kept his empire alive, was built by a man most people never saw. A man who preferred shadows to headlines. A man whose silence roared louder than any boast. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Medellin Cartel was moving billions of dollars worth of cocaine every year. The routes Gustavo built were so efficient, so relentless, that it seemed unstoppable. Money flowed back faster than it could be counted. They bought new planes, new boats, more safe houses, more officials. Every piece of the puzzle locked into place. But puzzles can be broken. And as the money grew, so did the attention. The DEA placed Gustavo on its radar. Colombian police marked him as a key figure. He was no longer just a shadow. He was a target. And in the quiet moments, Gustavo must have known that his greatest strength, his invisibility, was beginning to fray. Still, he pressed forward. Because to Gustavo, there was no other choice. Once the routes existed, once the rivers of money began flowing, there was no turning back. He had built the skeleton of an empire, and now it carried its own momentum. The architect had succeeded. But architects rarely control what happens once the building is filled. Pablo was filling it with ambition, with fire, with violence. And Gustavo, for all his caution, could not control every flame. The smuggling routes had made them kings. But kings draw hunters. And soon, those hunters would come not just for Pablo, but for the lion himself. Every empire has its myth, and every myth has its face. For the Medellin Cartel, the world saw Pablo Escobar, the firebrand, the outlaw king, the man whose very name became shorthand for terror and wealth. But behind that myth stood another figure, quieter, harder to read, almost invisible in the public imagination. Gustavo Gaviria, the Lion of Medellin. The nickname seemed strange to outsiders. A lion is loud, roaring across the savannah. But Gustavo was not loud. He rarely raised his voice. He wasn't the type to wave a gun in the air or boast about his empire. His lionhood was something subtler, something older. He was the lion not because he roared, but because he commanded the ground he walked upon. Calm, watchful, always aware. The predator who needed no display to remind you of his power. Inside the cartel, men spoke of him with a mix of respect and wariness. He wasn't feared in the same way Escobar was feared. Escobar terrified with unpredictability. He could smile one moment and order a killing the next. Gustavo was different. He unnerved people not because of his volatility, but because of his silence. You never quite knew what he was thinking, but you always felt that he was 2 steps ahead of you. To understand Gustavo's personality, you have to strip away the noise of Escobar's theatrics. Pablo was addicted to spectacle. He loved to be seen, to be recognized. He craved adoration and fear in equal measure. Gustavo craved neither. He preferred the shadows, the safety of anonymity. He didn't want statues. He wanted systems. He didn't want applause. He wanted efficiency. In meetings, Pablo would dominate the room, his words fast, his presence overwhelming. Gustavo would sit quietly listening. When he spoke, it was brief, measured, and final. Men who worked under him knew that if Gustavo said something, it was not a suggestion. It was law. He didn't need to shout. His authority was in the weight of his logic, the clarity of his vision. That was the essence of Gustavo's personality. Discipline. He treated the cartel less like a gang and more like a business empire. Every peso had to be counted, every shipment accounted for, every route secured. Where Pablo lived for the thrill of chaos, Gustavo believed in the order of numbers. To him, violence was not glory. It was expense, a risk to be calculated, a cost to be weighed against profit. And yet, Gustavo was not naive. He knew blood was the price of power. He may not have enjoyed violence the way some in the cartel did, but he understood its necessity. If someone threatened the network, if a partner betrayed them, if a shipment was stolen, then blood had to be spilled. Not for revenge, but for survival. In that sense, Gustavo was perhaps more dangerous than Pablo. Pablo could be reckless with violence, using it as theater. Gustavo used it like a scalpel, precise and cold. Men who crossed him rarely saw it coming. They would assume his quiet meant softness, that his calm was weakness. They learned otherwise. Gustavo could order a killing with the same tone he used to order new safe houses or banking fronts. To him, they were all logistics, pieces of a larger puzzle. But there was another side to him, one that made his personality even more complex. Gustavo was a family man. He was fiercely protective of his wife, his children, his extended relatives. He carried himself differently at home, softer, warmer, even affectionate. For a man who ran an empire of blood and cocaine, he seemed almost ordinary in private. He loved gatherings, dinners, the laughter of children. It was this duality, ruthless architect of an empire on one hand, devoted family man on the other, that made him so enigmatic. Those who knew him well said that Gustavo lived in two worlds, the shadow world of the cartel and the intimate world of family. He compartmentalized them with surgical precision. Where Pablo blurred the line, flaunting his wealth and power in both public and private, Gustavo kept the line sharp. The empire was business. Family was sanctuary. One did not bleed into the other, at least not if he could prevent it. Even in appearance, Gustavo contrasted with Pablo. Pablo grew heavier, more flamboyant in dress as his fortune grew. Gustavo dressed modestly, blending into crowds. He didn't want to be remembered for his looks. He wanted to disappear. Invisibility was his armor, and he wore it well. The DEA later described him as the financial wizard of the Medellin Cartel. But the truth is, that label only scratches the surface. He wasn't just about money. He was about control. He wanted every part of the machine to work seamlessly. He believed that the cartel's strength wasn't in Escobar's charisma, but in the hidden gears of organization. Without that organization, the empire would collapse under its own weight. In some ways, Gustavo's personality was more modern than Pablo's. Where Pablo ruled through fear and spectacle, Gustavo ruled through structure and systems. He thought less like a warlord and more like a CEO. Had he been born in a different place, a different time, with a different product, he might have built a legitimate multinational corporation. Instead, he built a drug empire. There is a story often told by those who study the cartel. One night, during a heated discussion, Pablo slammed his fist on the table, shouting about enemies who needed to be killed. Gustavo simply raised his hand, waited for silence, and said, "Killing them will cost us money. Paying them will make us more." The room fell quiet. Even Pablo, fiery and defiant, couldn't argue with the simplicity of the logic. That was Gustavo. Calm, direct, ruthless in his pragmatism. But his personality was not without flaws. His preference for shadows meant he sometimes underestimated the power of appearances. He believed invisibility would always protect him. He thought his lack of flamboyance made him untouchable. He didn't account for the fact that law enforcement would eventually dig deep enough to uncover even the quietest figures. His belief in systems, while brilliant, sometimes made him rigid. He could calculate risks with uncanny accuracy, but he couldn't always predict the chaos of human ambition, especially Pablo's. Still, within the cartel, Gustavo was the one man everyone trusted. Even rivals respected him. Even enemies feared him, not because he was loud, but because he was steady. He was the lion in the tall grass, unseen until it was too late. And this was perhaps the greatest irony of his personality. For all his calm, for all his invisibility, Gustavo was just as dangerous as Pablo, maybe more so. He didn't act out of pride or impulse. He acted out of necessity. And necessity is colder than rage. By the early 80s, the Medellin Cartel had become a behemoth, its smuggling routes flawless, its profits measured in billions. And yet, at the heart of this storm, Gustavo remained still, watching, calculating, always in the shadows. His personality didn't just shape the cartel, it defined its strength. The violence of Escobar made headlines, but the calm of Gustavo made the empire work. But calm can be deceiving. Beneath Gustavo's steady exterior was a man under pressure, a man trying to hold together a machine that was growing too large, too volatile. He could balance the books. He could design the routes. He could even order the necessary bloodshed. But could his calm contain the storm Pablo was unleashing on Colombia? That was the unanswered question. And as Escobar's ambition grew louder, Gustavo's silence began to feel less like safety and more like the silence before a storm. By the early 1980s, the cousins had moved far beyond cigarettes and stolen cars. Cocaine had transformed everything. What began as a hustle was now an industry, and that industry demanded more than smuggling routes and bribe customs officers. It demanded structure. It demanded a cartel. The word cartel carries its own weight. It conjures images of secret meetings, smoke-filled rooms, men in suits with guns waiting outside. But for Gustavo Gaviria and Pablo Escobar, building the Medellin Cartel was less about theater and more about survival. They understood that moving cocaine on such a scale required more than ambition. It required an organization so tightly woven that rivals couldn't cut through it, and governments couldn't tear it apart. The idea wasn't theirs alone. Other traffickers were rising too. Jorge Ochoa, Carlos Letter, Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha. Each man controlled pieces of the cocaine trade, each with his own routes, his own enforcers, his own ambitions. Alone, they were powerful. Together, they could be unstoppable. But bringing them together required something rare in the world of crime: trust. That trust was fragile. Every man at the table had blood on his hands and greed in his heart. But they also had enemies: the DEA, the Colombian government, rival cartels like Cali. Alone, each trafficker was vulnerable. Together, they could build something that resembled not a gang, but a corporation. It was Gustavo who understood the value of structure more than anyone else. Where others saw ego, he saw logistics. He knew that if each trafficker ran his own empire without coordination, chaos would consume them. So he pushed for collaboration, for a cartel that could pool resources, share routes, manage risks. Meetings were held in secret locations, often under heavy guard, with paranoia thick in the air. Pablo, charismatic and bold, often spoke first. He promised unity, wealth, protection. Gustavo, quieter, explained how it could work. He broke down the math, the logistics, the efficiency of working together. He argued less with passion and more with clarity, and clarity was hard to resist. What emerged from those meetings was the Medellin Cartel, a loose but powerful alliance of traffickers, bound not by friendship but by necessity. Each member kept his own operations, but profits were shared, strategies aligned, routes coordinated. It was less a monarchy and more a boardroom, though one where disagreements could end in blood. Pablo became the face of the cartel, the loud king whose name drew both admiration and terror. Gustavo became its architect, the man who ensured that shipments kept moving, money kept flowing, and the machine didn't collapse under its own weight. This division of labor was perfect, at least for a time. Pablo thrived on spectacle. Gustavo thrived on structure. Together, they created something the world had never seen before: a criminal corporation that rivaled multinational companies in size, reach, and influence. At its peak, the Medellin Cartel controlled as much as 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Billions of dollars flowed through its veins each year. That wealth bought loyalty, fear, and silence. Politicians were bribed, judges assassinated, police officers paid off. Entire communities in Medellin thrived on cartel money. To many, the cartel was not just a criminal organization. It was an alternative government, one that provided when the state failed. But the cartel was never just about money. It was about control. Gustavo designed systems to launder billions through Panama, the Caymans, and Swiss banks. He built networks of accountants, lawyers, and financial operatives who disguised dirty money as clean profit. He organized fleets of planes and boats, ensured safe houses were stocked, built redundancies so that no single seizure could cripple them. It was a machine, and Gustavo was its engineer. Inside that machine, violence was both tool and language. Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, loved brutality, unleashing death squads to crush rivals. Carlos later dreamed of building a cocaine utopia on a Bahamian island. The Ochoas balanced ruthlessness with diplomacy. And then there was Pablo, declaring war on anyone who stood in his way. Amid all this chaos, Gustavo remained calm, the steady hand that kept the gears from grinding to a halt. His personality shaped the cartel's internal dynamics. Men trusted his calculations, his quiet authority. They knew he wasn't reckless, that he valued survival over ego. That made him different from Pablo, whose hunger for recognition often pushed them toward dangerous wars. But even Gustavo couldn't always reign in Escobar. The cousins were bound by blood, and though Gustavo counseled caution, Pablo's ambition often won. Still, in those early years, the cartel thrived. Shipments moved with military precision. Profits soared. The cartel built entire smuggling corridors through Central America, the Caribbean, and into Florida. Miami became their golden gateway, flooded with cocaine so pure and cheap that it reshaped American nightlife. Dealers grew rich, violence exploded, and American authorities scrambled to understand what they were facing. For Gustavo, this was both triumph and tension. The systems he built were working better than he could have imagined. But he knew growth brought exposure. The more successful the cartel became, the more enemies it attracted. And enemies weren't just law enforcement. Rival cartels, jealous politicians, even men within their own ranks could turn. In a world built on greed, trust was always conditional. Even within the Medellin Cartel, alliances shifted. Letter's flamboyance drew attention. Gacha's brutality sparked wars. Pablo's ambition threatened to consume them all. Gustavo worked constantly to balance these forces, smoothing conflicts, keeping the focus on business. He knew that the cartel's greatest strength, its unity, was also its greatest weakness. One crack in the alliance could bring the whole machine down. To the outside world, though, the Medellin Cartel seemed invincible. The DEA described it as the most powerful criminal organization in history. Politicians in Colombia whispered about its reach with both fear and envy. Journalists who dared to write about it often paid with their lives. And through it all, Gustavo's name remained largely unknown. He preferred it that way. He wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in control. But control has limits. The Medellin Cartel was too big, too visible, too violent to remain hidden forever. The Americans were mobilizing. The Colombian state, under pressure, was beginning to fight back. And Escobar, intoxicated by his own power, was becoming bolder by the day. For Gustavo, the years of building had been about systems, logistics, survival. But survival in Colombia was never guaranteed. And as the 80s deepened, the cartel faced challenges no blueprint could fully contain. Still, in this moment, in the rise of the Medellin Cartel, Gustavo's genius shone brightest. He had taken the chaos of cocaine trafficking and turned it into an empire. An empire built on routes, money, fear, and silence. An empire that seemed, for a brief time, unstoppable. But empires, especially those built on blood and powder, never last. And in the shadows, Gustavo must have felt it, the weight of ambition pressing too hard. The cracks beginning to show. The storm Pablo was summoning would soon test everything Gustavo had built. The Medellin Cartel stood tall. But even lions cannot control the winds forever. Miami in the early 1980s was a city in transformation. The sun-drenched streets, the neon lights along Ocean Drive, the music spilling from clubs. It was paradise on the surface. But beneath the palm trees and beaches, the city was drowning in cocaine. Kilos stacked in warehouses, duffel bags of cash pouring into banks, and bodies floating in canals. Miami had become the front line of the cocaine explosion, and at the center of it all was the Medellin Cartel. The United States didn't know it yet, but Miami had become the cartel's beating heart. Every shipment that landed, every deal struck in the city's backrooms, was part of an empire Gustavo Gaviria helped design. Where Pablo Escobar saw Miami as the crown jewel, Gustavo saw it as the engine. And if the engine ran smoothly, the empire could expand without limits. At first, shipments trickled in through small planes and couriers. A kilo here, 5 kilos there. But demand was insatiable. Wealthy Americans were hooked, celebrities flaunted the powder in nightclubs, and dealers realized that the profit margins were unlike anything they had ever seen. By the time the Medellin Cartel scaled up, Miami wasn't just a market. It was the hub through which billions would flow. This is where Gustavo's personality mattered most. Pablo might have dreamed of dominating Miami with fear and spectacle, but Gustavo preferred precision. He focused on building partnerships with U.S. traffickers, men and women who could distribute cocaine quickly, efficiently, and without drawing too much attention. He knew that every kilo wasted, every deal botched, meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. In the quiet neighborhoods of Miami, safe houses sprang up like hidden arteries. From the outside, they looked ordinary: stucco homes, trimmed lawns, children playing nearby. Inside, they were filled with cocaine, stacked to the ceilings, guarded by men with guns. Cash flowed in just as fast, piled so high it was stored in closets, walls, even buried in yards. Gustavo handled these operations like a banker managing assets. He tracked shipments, balanced payments, and ensured distributors stayed loyal. He was meticulous. If a shipment went missing, Gustavo didn't rage. He investigated. He found the weak point in the chain and either fixed it or cut it out entirely. For him, Miami wasn't about glory. It was about flow. As long as the flow of cocaine and cash continued, the cartel lived. But Miami was not a quiet city. Violence erupted as Colombian traffickers clashed with Cuban distributors. Rival crews fought for control, and DEA agents began to notice the blood on the streets. Newspapers called it the cocaine cowboy era. Shootouts in broad daylight, drug lords flaunting wealth in nightclubs, banks stuffed with cash deposits so large that tellers ran out of space to count it. Escobar's name began surfacing in U.S. investigations. His reputation for violence cast a long shadow. But Gustavo's name? Rarely mentioned. That was by design. He stayed invisible, letting Pablo become the lightning rod while he worked in silence. To the DEA, Escobar was the target. To the cartel, Gustavo was the reason their operations in Miami didn't collapse under chaos. Gustavo's ability to stay low profile made the difference. While Pablo's appetite for spectacle drew attention, Gustavo's discipline kept the U.S. expansion running. He cultivated relationships with distributors who valued discretion, who wanted money more than headlines. He ensured shipments were staggered, routes varied, payments hidden. He created a system that could survive even when parts of it were exposed. In Miami, the profits were staggering. A kilo purchased in Colombia for a few $1,000s could sell for tens of thousands in the United States. Multiply that by tons, and the cartel was making billions. The money poured into banks so quickly that U.S. officials noticed cash deposits spiking in Miami institutions, sometimes tens of millions in a single day. Yet even as alarm bells rang, the machine kept running, and Gustavo kept running it. He wasn't the man in the club flaunting wealth. He wasn't the one photographed with cars, women, or mansions. He was the quiet shadow behind the curtain, the architect who ensured that the cocaine kept moving and the money kept flowing. His invisibility was his greatest strength. It was also why, for so long, law enforcement underestimated him. But invisibility has limits. The DEA began noticing patterns, shipments too consistent to be coincidence. Informants whispered about a cousin of Escobar, a man who never appeared in public, but whose influence ran deep. Slowly, Gustavo's name began to surface in reports. He was no longer completely hidden, but even then, his profile was nothing compared to Escobar's. Pablo's violence, his bombings, his assassinations, kept the spotlight fixed firmly on him, and Gustavo used that spotlight as cover. Still, the violence in Miami grew harder to ignore. Shootouts in shopping centers, bodies dumped on highways, families caught in crossfire. The cocaine boom had turned the city into a war zone. And though Gustavo preferred shadows, he understood violence was part of the business. When distributors failed, when rivals encroached, blood followed. For Gustavo, it was not theater, but necessity, a message written in gunfire to remind everyone who controlled the flow. The Americans called it the cocaine wars. But for Gustavo, it was business. Cold, calculated, relentless. He didn't seek the war. He managed it. He ensured it didn't disrupt the machine. That was his gift, the ability to find order in chaos, to keep the system running even when the streets outside were drenched in blood. Miami became the perfect mirror of the cousins themselves. On one side, Escobar, loud, violent, reckless, drawing attention with every move. On the other, Gustavo, quiet, efficient, invisible, ensuring that beneath the spectacle, the machine worked flawlessly. Together, they made Miami theirs. But Miami was also where the cracks began to show. U.S. authorities were not blind forever. The DEA intensified its efforts, partnering with Colombian police, tracking shipments, raiding safe houses. Each bust cost millions, and though Gustavo built redundancies, the pressure was rising. The Americans were learning. And once they learned, they would not stop. For now, though, the profits overshadowed the risks. The Medellin Cartel dominated Miami. Its cocaine-fueled nightclubs, Wall Street offices, suburban parties. Its money-corrupted banks, politicians, and law enforcement. And in the shadows, Gustavo kept his hands steady on the wheel. He was the lion, not roaring but watching, not boasting but building. Miami was not his stage, it was his engine room. And as long as the engine ran, the empire lived. But every engine overheats if pushed too hard. Every machine breaks under strain. And as billions poured through Miami, as bodies stacked up and U.S. authorities sharpened their knives, Gustavo must have known the truth. The city that made them kings could also be the city that began their fall. The cocaine poured into Miami like a flood, and with it came money, more money than anyone could count. By the early 1980s, the Medellin Cartel was making billions of dollars a year. The scale was so absurd that even those inside the empire struggled to comprehend it. Cash wasn't just a measure of success. It became a problem in itself. Imagine rooms filled floor to ceiling with U.S. dollars. Imagine bundles stacked so high they pressed against ceilings, spilling into hallways. The cartel was earning so much so fast that counting it became impossible. Some say Escobar once spent thousands of dollars each month just on rubber bands to wrap stacks of bills. Others claim that rats ate millions in stored cash before anyone noticed. To most people, these are legends. To Gustavo Gaviria, they were logistical nightmares that needed solutions. Because for Gustavo, money wasn't glory. It wasn't a symbol to be flashed in nightclubs or paraded in front of cameras. Money was flow, and flow had to be managed. If cocaine shipments were the veins of the empire, cash was its blood. And like blood, if it pooled too long in one place, it could clot, choke, and kill. The United States banks in Miami began to notice the flood. Millions of dollars were being deposited daily, often by men who looked nothing like wealthy businessmen. Bags of cash were carried in, sometimes so heavy the fabric ripped. Tellers grew nervous. The government began asking questions. And questions, for the cartel, meant danger. This was where Gustavo's genius shone brightest. While Pablo chased power and spectacle, Gustavo built the financial skeleton that allowed the Medellin Cartel not just to earn billions, but to keep them. He turned money laundering into an art form, decades before the term became common. He began with Panama. Its banking system, friendly to foreign deposits, became the perfect funnel. Gustavo and his financial operatives set up shell companies, businesses that existed only on paper, with names that sounded legitimate, but whose only purpose was to hide drug money. Through these companies, billions of dollars passed into Panamanian banks, disguised as profits from trade, shipping, or real estate. From Panama, the money flowed outward, into the Caymans, into Switzerland, into accounts so carefully layered that even investigators who traced them often hit dead ends. Gustavo used accountants and lawyers who specialized in secrecy, men who understood that for every question asked, an answer had to exist, even if it was a lie. But banks weren't the only tool. Gustavo invested in land, buildings, businesses, restaurants, farms, even soccer clubs became fronts. Money flowed in, appearing clean, untouchable. In Medellin and beyond, the cartel bought so much real estate that locals joked about neighborhoods being built on cocaine cash. And in truth, they were. Still, the money was too much to ever fully launder. There are stories of Gustavo ordering cash buried in barrels, hidden in walls, even sunk into rivers. Escobar once admitted that a percentage of their wealth, sometimes billions, was lost simply because it rotted or was eaten by rats. But Gustavo accepted those losses. To him, losing 10% to decay was better than losing everything to seizure. Inside the cartel, Gustavo became known as the financial wizard. Men trusted his ability to turn chaos into order, to keep the empire's blood flowing. He wasn't flashy. He didn't boast about their billions. But his systems meant the cartel could keep expanding, keep bribing, keep fueling the machine. Without those systems, the empire would have collapsed under the weight of its own success. Meanwhile, Pablo reveled in the spectacle of wealth. He built Hacienda Napoles, a sprawling estate with mansions, lakes, and even a private zoo. He handed out money in the barrios, built soccer fields, paid for weddings and funerals. He wanted to be seen as both king and benefactor. Gustavo allowed it, even managed the money that made it possible. But, deep down, he must have known that such visibility came with danger. Because money is never silent. It speaks, it leaves trails, it creates suspicion. For every dollar Gustavo laundered, 10 more screamed for attention. Governments noticed. The DEA noticed. Colombian politicians noticed. And as billions piled up, so did enemies. In the mid-'80s, U.S. investigators began piecing together how the cartel moved its wealth. They couldn't always catch the cocaine, but they could follow the money. Task forces were created. Operations were launched. Banks that once welcomed deposits were pressured to close accounts. For Gustavo, it was a new kind of war, not with bullets, but with numbers. He adapted. Routes shifted. New companies appeared overnight. Money was spread thinner, moved faster, hidden deeper. It became a constant chess match, each move countered by new strategies. For every account frozen, 3 new ones opened. For every investigation, new documents were forged. It was exhausting, but Gustavo thrived in it. He was never reckless. He always had a backup plan. Yet even he couldn't solve everything. The sheer volume of cash was overwhelming. No system was perfect. Mistakes happened. Shipments were seized. Accounts were discovered. And with every loss, the pressure grew. Still, the Medellin Cartel survived because of Gustavo's discipline. Other traffickers, too flashy, too careless, fell quickly when their money was exposed. Gustavo's methods gave the cartel resilience. It could take hits and keep going. That resilience was why, for a time, the Medellin Cartel seemed untouchable. But money also changed the men themselves. Wealth on such a scale warps perspective. Pablo grew more reckless, convinced his billions made him invincible. He used his fortune to buy political influence, even a seat in Colombia's Congress. Gustavo, more cautious, worried that such visibility would bring disaster. He urged discretion, urged patience. But Escobar rarely listened. The billions that Gustavo managed became both their strength and their curse. With money, they bought loyalty. With money, they silenced enemies. With money, they built an empire that spanned continents. But money also made them targets, not just of law enforcement, but of rivals, of politicians, of anyone who wanted a piece of their fortune. In private moments, Gustavo must have felt the weight of it. The knowledge that every bill he laundered was another thread in a web too vast to hold forever. The awareness that no matter how clever his systems, no matter how deep his shadows, The sheer size of the empire made invisibility impossible. And yet, he kept going. Because what choice did he have? Once billions flowed, there was no turning back. The Medellin Cartel wasn't just a criminal organization anymore. It was a parallel economy, a force so vast it rivaled governments. And Gustavo Gaviria was the man who kept that economy alive. But in the quiet of his mind, perhaps he wondered, how long can you hide billions before the world comes crashing through your doors? By the mid-1980s, the Medellin Cartel was no longer just a criminal network. It was a state within a state, with billions of dollars, armies of sicarios, and influence that reached from Colombian barrios to Wall Street offices. But with power came hunger, and no one hungered louder than Pablo Escobar. Gustavo Gaviria had built the machine. He kept the gears oiled, the routes flowing, the money hidden. His goal was survival, steady, efficient, invisible. But Pablo wanted more. He wanted legitimacy, recognition, immortality. He no longer wanted to be just a shadow king. He wanted to stand in the sun, crown in hand, daring the world to look away. The problem was simple. Visibility is death in the underworld. And Gustavo knew it. Again and again, he counseled caution. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Keep the empire alive. But Escobar wasn't listening. He had tasted power and wanted the whole meal. It began with politics. In 1982, Pablo Escobar was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Congress. For a brief moment, the most infamous trafficker in the world sat inside the halls of government, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. For him, it was validation, proof that his money could buy not just influence, but respect. For Gustavo, it was a nightmare. He understood what Pablo didn't. Power in the shadows can be protected. Power in the spotlight is a target. Every speech Escobar gave, every photograph taken, was another spotlight pointed at the cartel. Every politician who whispered his name in disgust was another enemy added to the list. And enemies multiplied quickly. Rodrigo Larabonilla, the Minister of Justice, denounced Escobar publicly, exposing him as a trafficker. Journalists began writing stories about his wealth, his crimes, his ambitions. The U.S. government increased pressure on Colombia to act. Suddenly, the empire Gustavo had designed to be invisible was on every front page. Pablo responded not with retreat, but with rage. When Larabonilla stood against him, Escobar had him assassinated in 1984, gunned down on a Bogotá street. The message was clear: oppose me and die. But the cost was immense. The Colombian government, under pressure from Washington, declared war on the cartel. Extradition treaties were signed. The United States wanted Escobar's head, and the Colombian state, long corrupted and divided, finally began to fight back. For Gustavo, this was the worst-case scenario. The machine they had built relied on discretion. It thrived on bribes, not bombs, on silence, not headlines. But Pablo had turned their empire into a battlefield. The Medellin Cartel was no longer just a business. It was an insurgency. And Gustavo, the man who believed in efficiency, now had to operate in chaos. The violence escalated quickly. Judges assassinated. Police officers murdered. Journalists silenced. Bombs detonated in city streets. Escobar unleashed terror, as though it were another product, flooding Colombia with fear. His message was blunt. If you come for me, I will bring the country down with me. Gustavo disagreed with the strategy, but family loyalty bound him. He stood by Pablo, even as he warned of disaster. He managed the finances, kept the routes alive, ensured the money didn't stop flowing. But he also knew every bomb planted, every politician killed, made survival less likely. The walls were closing in. The war escalated further when Escobar targeted extradition. For him, the idea of dying in a U.S. prison was unacceptable. So he declared war on the policy itself, unleashing violence designed to terrify Colombian politicians into refusing extradition requests. It worked, at least temporarily. Judges ruled against extradition out of fear. But the blood cost was immense. In Medellin, fear became daily life. Car bombs shook the city. Assassinations became routine. Families whispered at night, wondering if their sons or daughters would make it home. And all the while, Escobar reveled in his role as both outlaw and revolutionary. He positioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, a man of the people fighting against corrupt elites and foreign control. Many in the barrios believed him. They loved him, even as the bombs exploded. But Gustavo knew better. He knew this wasn't revolution. It was escalation. And escalation always ends in collapse. He tried to temper Pablo, to argue for quieter strategies, for negotiation, for survival. But Pablo, fueled by ego and rage, refused. The cousins who once shared a vision were now drifting apart in purpose, even if blood kept them close. The Americans intensified their pursuit. DEA agents built networks of informants, tracked shipments, raided safe houses. The Colombian state, pressured by Washington, deployed elite police units. The cartel responded with more violence, more blood. The war had become total. And yet, amid the chaos, Gustavo kept working. He continued managing billions, laundering money, maintaining smuggling routes. Even as bombs shook Medellin, planes carried cocaine north, and cash flowed back south. The machine still ran because of him. But each day, it ran closer to the edge. There are stories that in private moments, Gustavo urged Pablo to seek peace, to negotiate, to find a way out. Some say he believed in surrendering to Colombian authorities rather than face U.S. extradition, trusting that money could still buy safety at home. Others say he wanted to shift focus back to business, away from politics and war. Whatever his advice, Pablo rarely listened. Escobar's pride had outgrown his cousin's caution. By the late 80s, Colombia was on fire. Entire cities lived in fear. The Medellin Cartel was both revered and reviled, its name etched into every corner of society. Escobar was a king, but a king surrounded by enemies sharpening their blades. And Gustavo, the architect, the lion in the shadows, was trapped inside a war he never wanted. The irony was cruel. The systems Gustavo built were designed to keep them invisible, but Escobar's war made invisibility impossible. The cartel was too big, too loud, too violent to hide. And no system, no matter how brilliant, can survive forever under that kind of spotlight. Still, Gustavo remained loyal. Blood demanded it. Even as he saw disaster looming, he stood by his cousin. He had built the foundation. He would not abandon it, even if it crumbled beneath him. But deep down, he must have known this was not a war they could win. The Americans were relentless. The Colombian state, though bloodied, was determined. And Pablo Escobar, for all his charisma and cunning, was fighting battles that could only end one way. For Gustavo, the question was no longer whether the machine would fall. It was how long he could keep it running before the collapse consumed them all. The Medellin Cartel in the late 1980s was a storm, raging across Colombia and beyond. Bombs thundered through Medellin streets, assassins prowled Bogotá avenues, and U.S. agents hunted cocaine routes like wolves. At the center of that storm stood Pablo Escobar, roaring like a king determined to outshout the world. But in the shadows beside him was another figure, calm, steady, quiet. Gustavo Gaviria. If Escobar was chaos, Gustavo was balance. He was the calm counterpart, the one man capable of tempering the storm, even if only slightly. Their relationship was a strange duality, fire and water, noise and silence, chaos and order. Together, they created an empire. Alone, each might have been swallowed by the world. Inside the cartel, men spoke of their bond with a mixture of awe and fear. Escobar inspired terror with his unpredictability. Gustavo inspired respect with his consistency. If you stood before Pablo, you never knew if you'd leave alive. If you stood before Gustavo, you knew your fate would be decided logically, coldly, without passion. Some found that scarier, because rage can be reasoned with, but silence? Silence gives nothing away. In meetings, Escobar would dominate with his voice. He gestured, shouted, threatened, promised. His ambition filled the room like smoke, suffocating everyone present. And then, after the roar, Gustavo would speak. His words were few, but each one carried weight. Where Pablo's fire threatened to burn everything down, Gustavo's calm placed boundaries. He would explain numbers, outline risks, propose alternatives. And though Escobar often dismissed him, the others listened. They knew that without Gustavo's logic, the empire might collapse under Pablo's ego. Their private conversations revealed the same contrast. Pablo dreamed of ruling Colombia, of bending governments to his will, of being remembered as more than a drug lord. Gustavo reminded him of practicalities, the money, the shipments, the danger of visibility. He spoke not as a subordinate, but as a partner, the only person Escobar truly trusted to tell him the truth. That trust was absolute. Escobar might have doubted generals, assassins, or business partners, but he never doubted Gustavo. The bond of blood, forged in childhood, reinforced by years of partnership, made Gustavo untouchable. Others might betray, others might fall away, but Gustavo remained, steady as stone. And yet, that loyalty was a burden. Gustavo knew Pablo's choices were dragging them toward disaster. Every bombing, every assassination, every public stunt painted a larger target on their backs. He counseled restraint, urged negotiations, suggested quieter strategies. But Pablo, consumed by pride and fury, refused. For Gustavo, this created a dilemma: abandon the cousin he had built an empire with, or stand by him even as the world closed in. He chose loyalty. He always chose loyalty. What made Gustavo the calm counterpart was not just his personality, but his worldview. He didn't see violence as glory. He saw his cost. He didn't crave fame. He craved control. To him, the empire's success wasn't measured in headlines or fear, but in efficiency. Were the routes secure? Were the accounts safe? Were the shipments moving? That was victory in his eyes. And as long as he could manage those, he believed the empire could survive, even if Pablo was tearing the country apart above him. There is a story whispered by cartel insiders. During a heated argument, Escobar demanded that a rival politician be killed. He raged, pacing the room, declaring that fear was the only way to hold power. Gustavo sat silently, then finally said, "Fear is expensive. Respect lasts longer." The room fell quiet. Even Escobar hesitated. That was Gustavo's power, not in rage, not in force, but in the calm logic that reminded everyone of the cost of chaos. But calm has limits. Even Gustavo's voice of reason could not contain Escobar's obsession. The cousins began to diverge, not in loyalty, but in vision. Pablo saw himself as a revolutionary, a man who could bend Colombia to his will. Gustavo saw himself as a businessman, a manager of systems. One sought immortality, the other sought survival. The conflict between those visions was a slow fracture in the foundation they had built together. Still, in the day-to-day, Gustavo remained essential. He oversaw finances, laundered billions, kept shipments moving despite the escalating war. Even as bombs shook Medellin, planes carried cocaine to Miami. Even as judges were assassinated, money flowed into Panama banks. The machine kept running because Gustavo kept it running. His calm was the glue that held the empire together, even as Escobar's fire threatened to tear it apart. And for all their differences, the cousins needed each other. Escobar needed Gustavo's systems, his logic, his caution. Gustavo needed Pablo's charisma, his ambition, his ability to inspire loyalty and fear. Alone, each would have failed. Together, they thrived, at least for a time. But beneath the surface, the tension grew. Gustavo could see the future clearer than Pablo. He knew the United States would never stop. He knew the Colombian state, though corrupt, would eventually find enough resolve to fight. He knew their visibility made them vulnerable. And he knew that if Pablo refused to bend, the empire would collapse. In private moments, perhaps he allowed himself to imagine another path, one where the cartel stayed quiet, stayed in the shadows, kept making billions without making war. A path where Pablo listened, where survival mattered more than pride. But that path was never taken. Escobar's fire consumed every alternative. Still, Gustavo stayed, because loyalty, for him, was not negotiable. He had built this empire with his cousin. He would not abandon him, even if it meant dying with him. That was the tragedy of his calm. It was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. By the late 80s, the Medellin Cartel was both at its height and on the edge of collapse. Billions flowed, but blood flowed too. Fear ruled Colombia, but so did resistance. Escobar grew louder, bolder, more reckless. Gustavo grew quieter, more cautious, more burdened. He was the calm counterpart, but calm cannot stop a storm forever. The irony is haunting. Escobar is remembered as the Teflon Don of Medellin, the man who defied the world. But Gustavo, the quiet lion, was the one who made it all possible. Without his calm, the empire would have burned itself out years earlier. Without his systems, Escobar's fire would have consumed nothing but smoke. And yet, history rarely remembers the calm. It remembers the roar, the spectacle, the chaos. Gustavo's personality, disciplined, logical, invisible, made him indispensable, but also made him forgettable to those outside the underworld. He was the lion who ruled without roaring, the calm that kept the storm alive. But storms don't last, and even lions can be hunted. As the 1980s drew to a close, the question wasn't whether the cartel would face its reckoning. It was when. And when that reckoning came, would Gustavo's calm be enough to save them? Or would his silence be drowned out by the roar of Escobar's war? By the late 1980s, Medellin was a city under siege, not by an invading army, but by its own sons. Bombs echoed through neighborhoods, assassinations struck in broad daylight, and fear seeped into the rhythm of daily life. This was the price of Pablo Escobar's war. But behind the spectacle, another truth lingered. Violence was not only Escobar's obsession. It was also Gustavo Gaviria's necessity. Gustavo preferred order. He believed in numbers, systems, balance. But no empire of cocaine could be built without blood. Every shipment, every bribe, every safe house carried risk. And in Colombia, risk meant rivals, traitors, informants. Those risks could not be handled with spreadsheets. They had to be silenced. Violence wasn't his language, but he spoke it fluently when required. To understand Medellin in those years is to understand a city living with death as casually as rain. Young men with guns roamed barrios as sicarios, hired killers loyal to the cartel. For many, joining Escobar's army was the only path out of poverty. They earned more in a week than their fathers did in months. They carried pistols, rode motorcycles, and knew that if they died, their families would still be paid. Death became currency, and Gustavo, though calmer than his cousin, paid the price when business demanded it. The cartel had enforcement squads, teams trained to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. Gustavo oversaw them with the same detachment he used for finances. If Pablo ordered a killing in rage, Gustavo approved one with logic. An accountant who skimmed profits, a courier who talked too much, a rival sniffing at their routes, all met the same fate. Gustavo didn't need a rage. He only needed to calculate. Was this person a liability? If yes, then the decision was made. Men who worked under him described his coldness as unnerving. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply looked at the facts and gave the order. To some, that made him more frightening than Pablo. Escobar's violence was unpredictable. Gustavo's was inevitable. But violence in Medellin wasn't limited to the cartel's enemies. It spilled across the city, consuming innocent lives. Bombs placed to kill judges also killed children walking to school. Assassinations of politicians left bystanders bleeding in the street. For every targeted strike, collateral damage spread wider. And while Pablo embraced terror as a weapon of war, Gustavo carried the weight differently. He knew every innocent death drew more hatred, more pressure, more enemies. Yet even he couldn't stop it, because by then, violence wasn't just a tool. It was the oxygen the empire breathed. Without it, they couldn't control rivals. Without it, They couldn't silence informants. Without it, their billions meant nothing. Gustavo may have preferred shadows, but he lived in a world where shadows were filled with gunfire. Inside Medellin, life became a strange duality. In poor neighborhoods, Escobar was still seen as a benefactor. He built soccer fields, handed out cash, paid for medicine. Mothers wept for their sons killed as sicarios, yet praised the cartel for keeping food on their tables. Gustavo, always in the background, rarely received the same devotion. He wasn't the man giving out gifts. He was the man ensuring the money was there to buy those gifts. He was the architect of the system that allowed Pablo's Robin Hood image to survive, even as violence consumed the city. But Gustavo also saw the darker side. He knew Medellin's youth were being devoured by the machine. Boys barely old enough to shave were carrying pistols, killing judges, dying in shootouts. Each death fueled the legend of Escobar, but also fueled the hatred of the state. Gustavo's logic told him this couldn't last. The violence was unsustainable, but he also knew there was no reversing it. Once unleashed, blood spreads like ink in water, impossible to contain. Rivals added to the chaos. The Cali cartel, their bitter enemies, fought with quieter precision. They bribed where Medellin bombed. They infiltrated where Medellin intimidated. But even they weren't immune to violence. Wars between the two cartels left bodies in the streets, each side striking the other's infrastructure, each side determined to dominate. Gustavo played his role in these wars with the same cold calculation he brought to everything. For him, rivals weren't enemies to hate. They were obstacles to remove. Law enforcement wasn't spared either. Colombian police officers, underpaid and overwhelmed, often had two choices: accept bribes or accept death. Many chose bribes. Those who resisted were hunted. Gustavo managed these strategies not with anger, but with precision. Which commanders could be bought? Which patrols needed warnings? Which officers had to disappear? It was all part of the equation. Still, the violence weighed on him. Men close to him said that Gustavo's eyes carried a quiet heaviness in those years, a recognition that the machine he had built was now fueled as much by death as by cocaine. He never spoke of regret, but he understood the cost more clearly than Pablo. Escobar saw violence as power. Gustavo saw it as debt, and debts eventually must be paid. The Colombian government responded with increasing force. Elite police units, supported by the United States, hunted cartel members. Informants whispered names. Safe houses were raided. Each strike led to retaliation, each retaliation to more blood. Medellin became a battlefield, not of armies, but of shadows. And Gustavo, calm as ever, tried to manage a storm that was tearing the city apart. Perhaps the greatest irony of his role in Medellin's violence was that he never sought it. He didn't crave the roar of explosions or the sight of enemies falling. But he accepted it, used it, and orchestrated it when required. In doing so, he became inseparable from the terror that defined the city. History remembers Escobar as the face of that terror. But the truth is, the lion's paw prints were there too, etched in blood across Medellin streets. And Gustavo must have known, violence has a way of circling back. Each killing created enemies. Each bomb created grief. Grief turned into hatred. Hatred turned into resolve. And resolve eventually brought hunters. By 1989, Medellin was choking. The death toll rose. The pressure mounted. The enemies grew bolder. Pablo roared louder, daring the world to defy him. Gustavo remained calm, steady, the counterpart who kept the machine alive. But even lions cannot control the tide forever. The violence of Medellin defined an era, an empire, a city scarred by blood. And for Gustavo Gaviria, it was both his greatest weapon and his greatest curse. He could wield it, direct it, use it to hold power, but he cannot escape it. Because in Medellin, in those years, violence wasn't just part of the cartel. Violence was a cartel. And Gustavo, the quiet architect, was in the heart of it. Calm, calculating, watching the storm he helped unleash spiral into something even he could no longer control. By the late 1980s, The Medellin Cartel had become the most powerful criminal empire on earth. It moved billions of dollars, flooded the United States with cocaine, and waged open war against the Colombian state. For years, its leaders had seemed untouchable, ghosts operating in the shadows while the world stumbled to catch up. But the ghosts were now leaving footprints, and the hunters were closing in. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, had been tracking cocaine shipments for over a decade. At first, their efforts were scattered, piecing together fragments of a puzzle too vast to comprehend. But by 1985, the agency's focus sharpened. They knew Medellin was the source. They knew Escobar was the face. And increasingly, they began hearing whispers of another man, the cousin, the quiet one, Gustavo Gaviria. It was almost poetic. Pablo Escobar dominated headlines, the flamboyant king who declared war on the world. But DEA reports began noting a different figure, one rarely seen, never quoted, but always present in the background. Informants said he handled the money, the logistics, the business that made Escobar's violence possible. To investigators, Gustavo became the ghost behind the ghost, and ghosts, once named, can be hunted. The DEA's strategy shifted. Instead of chasing every kilo, every boat, every plane, they followed the money. And money, unlike men, leaves a trail. Gustavo had built elaborate laundering systems, moving billions through Panama, Switzerland, and countless shell companies. But even the best systems spring leaks. An account opened too quickly, a deposit too large, a courier too nervous at the border. Each leak gave investigators a thread, and threads, when pulled, unravel even the most careful designs. By 1986, task forces in Miami and Bogota were working around the clock. They mapped cartel routes, intercepted shipments, pressured banks to report suspicious deposits. They interviewed defectors, flipped couriers, cultivated informants. And again, Gustavo's name surfaced. Not loudly, not like Escobar's, but steadily, like the hum of a machine behind the walls. In Medellin, Gustavo knew the net was tightening. He read reports, heard whispers, tracked raids. His instinct was always the same: adapt. He shifted routes, closed accounts, built new fronts. When the DEA pressured Panamanian banks, he turned to the Caymans. When customs tightened inspections, he diversified shipments. His mind worked like a chessboard, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But even chess masters can't control every piece forever. The Americans weren't alone. Colombian authorities, battered by years of violence, had begun cooperating more closely. Elite police units, supported with U.S. intelligence and funding, launched raids against cartel operations. Safe houses were uncovered, warehouses raided, money seized. Each success was small compared to the cartel's wealth, but each success taught investigators something new. The hunters were learning the patterns. And Gustavo, calm as ever, adjusted. He never panicked. That was his strength. Where Pablo responded to pressure with bombs and assassinations, Gustavo responded with silence. He didn't roar. He restructured. If a route was compromised, he built another. If an account was frozen, he opened 3 more. His calm was his armor. But even he couldn't erase his name from the growing files in DEA offices. Gustavo Gaviria, financial architect of the Medellin Cartel, suspected mastermind of smuggling logistics, Escobar's most trusted lieutenant. The Americans wanted Escobar, but they began to realize something chilling. If you cut off the lion, the empire might fall faster than if you killed the king. By 1987, DEA agents in Miami were building cases specifically against him. They traced shipments back to shell companies tied to his networks. They flipped mid-level operatives who testified that Gustavo handled financial instructions. They gathered intelligence that placed him at the center of decision-making, even if he rarely appeared in person. To the DEA, he was no longer just a ghost. He was a target. The pressure mounted. Colombian newspapers began mentioning his name, though cautiously. Politicians whispered that Escobar's cousin was as dangerous as the man himself, only quieter. Rivals in Cali spread rumors, feeding information to authorities to weaken Medellin's grip. The circle was tightening, and Gustavo knew it. Still, he didn't change his ways. He remained invisible, rarely photographed, rarely seen in public. Unlike Escobar, he didn't build a flamboyant image. He didn't crave the spotlight. That invisibility delayed his downfall, but it couldn't stop it. Because no matter how quiet he remained, the money screamed louder than silence ever could. The DEA escalated further. Joint operations with Colombian police began targeting cartel accountants, couriers, and financial operatives. Raids on Miami's safe houses uncovered ledgers that tied directly to Gustavo's networks. Informants claimed he had final approval on major financial moves. Even if they couldn't catch him in person, they could trace his fingerprints through the money. In Medellin, Gustavo felt the strain. He doubled security, shifted safe houses, became more cautious with meetings. He was disciplined, but discipline can't erase inevitability. The Americans were relentless, and the Colombians, though corruptible, were under immense pressure from Washington. Every move the cartel made was shadowed, every shipment at risk. Escobar, enraged by the pressure, lashed out with more violence. Judges killed, politicians assassinated, bombs detonated in Bogotá. Gustavo, as always, counseled caution. He told his cousin that every bomb only gave the Americans more resolve. Every assassination brought the state closer to total war. But Pablo was deaf to reason. He believed fear would save him. Gustavo knew fear only sharpened the hunter's blade. And so the cousins drifted further apart in vision. Even his loyalty kept them bound. Pablo saw himself as invincible, a king beyond reach. Gustavo saw the cracks widening, the inevitability of collapse. He didn't say it openly, perhaps he couldn't, but in his heart, he must have known. The empire was living on borrowed time. By 1989, the DEA had identified him as one of their top targets. Not as loudly as Escobar, but just as critically. They knew killing or capturing the lion would cripple the cartel structure. Escobar could roar all he wanted, but without his cousin's systems, the empire would stumble. The hunt for Gustavo Gaviria was no longer speculation. It was active, methodical, relentless. The DEA and Colombian forces were not just after the king. They were after the lion. And once hunters name their prey, the chase never stops. For Gustavo, calm as ever, the question was not if they would come. It was when. By 1989, Miami was no longer just the cartel's golden gateway. It had become the battlefield. The DEA, the Coast Guard, U.S. Customs, and local police were no longer blind to the flood of cocaine. The days of slipping shipments past sleepy inspectors were over. Miami was awake, and its streets, once paved with Medellin's gold, now bristled with the teeth of hunters. The bust began small. A courier stopped at the airport. A speedboat intercepted in the Florida Keys. A safe house raided after a neighbor grew suspicious. At first, these were drops in the ocean compared to the tons that kept arriving. Gustavo Gaviria, calm as always, brushed them off as acceptable losses. In his mind, one shipment lost was a cost of doing business, like a factory writing off broken machines. But then the losses began to grow. A stash house in Miami yielded hundreds of kilos. A fishing boat, its hull packed with cocaine, was seized by the Coast Guard. DEA agents, fueled by new intelligence networks, started flipping mid-level distributors, men who traded prison time for information. And that information pointed back to Medellin. The Americans called it the Miami cocaine crisis. Newspapers plastered headlines about the war on drugs, about violent shootouts, about cash deposits so large that local banks ran out of counting machines. Politicians demanded action, and action meant pressure on Miami, on Colombia, on the cartel itself. For Pablo Escobar, the pressure only provoked fury. He saw the busts as challenges to his crown. He talked of killing more judges, bombing more buildings, intimidating the world into submission. But Gustavo knew this was different. This wasn't Colombia, where fear could buy silence. This was the United States, a country that treated cartel violence not as intimidation, but as provocation. The more they struck, the more relentless the Americans became. So Gustavo did what he always did. He adapted. He diversified routes. If Miami was burning, he shifted shipments through Central America, through Mexico, through islands in the Caribbean. He experimented with new methods. Cocaine hidden in commercial cargo, cocaine dissolved into liquids, cocaine packed into hollowed-out furniture. Every seizure taught him something new, and every lesson was applied to the next shipment. But adaptation had limits. The DEA had learned the patterns. They invested in better radar, more patrols, tighter customs inspections. They tracked the money as carefully as the drugs, following deposits through banks, freezing accounts, seizing assets. Each success emboldened them. Each raid cut deeper into the cartel's networks. Miami, once a city where the cartel moved freely, had become hostile ground. For Gustavo, it was a chess match played at full speed. He rotated safe houses constantly, moved couriers before they grew suspicious, shifted operations to cities like New York, Los Angeles, even Houston. Miami was still the jewel, but it was no longer safe. It was a trap that tightened with every bust. The pressure in Florida also revealed something deeper: cracks in the cartel's American partnerships. Distributors who once moved product fearlessly now hesitated. Fear of prison outweighed loyalty to Medellin. Informants multiplied. Undercover agents slipped into networks. Every meeting, every handoff, carried the risk of betrayal. Still, Gustavo's calm steadied the empire. Where others panicked, he strategized. He reminded his cousin that the losses, though painful, were survivable. The cartel's reach extended beyond Miami. Cocaine was no longer just a Florida problem. It was a national one, and Medellin had roots everywhere. Gustavo's genius wasn't in avoiding every loss. It was in ensuring the machine never stopped moving, no matter how many gears broke along the way. But in private, he must have felt the strain. The Americans were not like Colombian officials. They could not all be bribed. They could not all be threatened. They were systematic, relentless, backed by resources that dwarfed anything Colombia could muster. And once they had their teeth in Miami, they would not let go. The pressure spread south. U.S. officials leaned harder on the Colombian government, demanding extraditions, demanding action, demanding results. Colombia, already bleeding from Escobar's terror campaign, was caught in the middle. To the state, extradition was survival. To Escobar, it was death. Gustavo, ever the pragmatist, saw the truth. Extradition meant the end of invisibility. If the Americans dragged them north, no amount of bribes or shadows could protect them. So he doubled down on financial survival. While Pablo roared about war, Gustavo built escape hatches in the form of hidden accounts, investments, offshore havens. He knew the empire was under siege, and survival would depend not just on cocaine, but on money hidden deeply enough to outlast the storm. Still, the busts in Miami hurt. They weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were blows to the cartel's image of invincibility. Each newspaper headline about a seizure chipped away at the myth. Each indictment filed in U.S. courts narrowed the shadows in which they hid. The lion could stay calm, but even lions bleed when the hunt drags on long enough. For Escobar, the Miami busts only fueled paranoia. He began seeing betrayal everywhere, in distributors, in politicians, even in allies. Gustavo tried to calm him, to explain that pressure didn't mean collapse, that adaptation was possible. But Escobar's pride was louder than reason. Where Gustavo saw a chessboard, Pablo saw a battlefield. And on a battlefield, he only knew one tactic: war. But wars don't win against nations like the United States. Gustavo knew that. He knew their empire was stretching too far, too fast, drawing too much fire. And though he kept building, kept adapting, a question gnawed at him. How long before the machine cracked beyond repair? By 1990, the DEA had declared the Medellin Cartel the most dangerous criminal organization in the world. The Miami task forces worked day and night, tracing every lead, targeting every shipment, mapping every account. For the first time, Gustavo was not just a ghost in their files. He was a name, a priority, a man they wanted as badly as Escobar. The Miami bus had done more than seize cocaine. They had exposed the lion's shadow. And once exposed, shadows can no longer hide. By 1990, Gustavo Gaviria was no longer just a whisper in DEA reports or a name muttered among Colombian police. He was a marked man, a target as critical as Pablo Escobar himself. Not because he loved the spotlight, he avoided it with religious discipline, but because law enforcement had finally understood what insiders always knew. Without Gustavo, the empire would crumble. The lion had stayed in the shadows for decades, but shadows can't hide forever. The law was closing in. The first real blows came in the form of seizures. Millions of dollars in cash, intercepted planes, confiscated cargo. Each loss hurt, not only because of the money, but because of the exposure. Gustavo had built the cartel's finances like a maze. Countless shell companies, offshore accounts, and layer deposits. But even the most complex maze has exits, and investigators were beginning to find them. In Miami, indictments piled up. Judges signed warrants. Task forces wrote his name on chalkboard alongside Escobar's, letters, and gotchas. To the DEA, Gustavo was no longer the invisible architect. He was the financial brain, the man whose capture could cripple the Medellin Cartel more than any ton of seized cocaine. But Gustavo, calm as always, adapted. When accounts in Panama were frozen, he shifted to the Caymans. When Swiss investigators sniffed around, he moved funds to new shell companies. When informants pointed to Miami's safe houses, he ordered them abandoned overnight, shipments rerouted through Mexico or the Caribbean. Where Pablo responded to pressure with rage and violence, Gustavo responded with silence and logic. Still, he couldn't ignore the tightening noose. Colombian police began raiding properties tied to the cartel. Court cases were filed against front companies. Politicians, under U.S. pressure, spoke his name in whispers. The lion, for so long invisible, was now visible to hunters across two nations. Yet what made Gustavo remarkable was his ability to slip through cracks, even as walls closed in. When safe houses were raided, he was already gone. When police traced money to companies, he had already shut them down. When informants testified, he had already rotated his networks. He was cautious, disciplined, always thinking 2 moves ahead. To his enemies, it was infuriating. To his allies, it was proof of his genius. But genius couldn't erase risk. On several occasions, Gustavo came close to capture. One raid in Medellin nearly trapped him in a safe house, bullets tearing through walls as police stormed the building. He escaped through a hidden exit, slipping into the night while others died. Another time, U.S. investigators believed they had traced millions directly to him, only to watch the trail vanish in a web of offshore accounts. Each near miss only heightened his legend, the lion who couldn't be caught. For Pablo, Gustavo's ability to evade the law was proof of their invincibility. But for Gustavo, it was something else, a reminder of how fragile survival really was. He knew luck played as much a role as strategy. And luck, like money, eventually runs out. The law grew more relentless. Colombian authorities, backed by U.S. intelligence, tightened their net. Extradition treaties loomed, striking fear into every trafficker. For Escobar, extradition was death. For Gustavo, it was the end of shadows. In Colombia, he could bribe, negotiate, survive. In the United States, there would be no shadows deep enough to hide. And so he fought, not with bombs or bullets, but with strategy. He funded legal teams, bribed judges, pressured politicians. He worked tirelessly to block extradition, to keep the cartel's leaders within Colombia's porous justice system. But each victory felt temporary, like patching cracks in a dam already swelling with pressure. The irony was sharp. Gustavo had built a cartel to be invisible, efficient, untouchable. Yet now he was named, hunted, pursued with the full force of 2 governments. His invisibility was gone. His name was written in headlines. His shadow was illuminated. And still, he fought to keep the machine alive. Inside the cartel, some whispered that Gustavo's calm was fading. The strain showed in his eyes, the weight of years of pressure pressing harder. But outwardly, he remained steady. He gave orders with the same quiet authority. He calculated profits with the same precision. He directed shipments with the same discipline. To his men, he was still the lion. To his enemies, he was still a ghost too slippery to grasp. But ghosts can't outrun the living forever. By mid-1990, the DEA and Colombian police placed him at the top of their lists. They wanted Escobar, yes, but they also wanted the lion. They believed, perhaps correctly, that if they cut out the brain, the body would collapse. Without Gustavo, Escobar's fire would burn uncontrolled, consuming itself. Without the lion, the Medellin Cartel would stumble. And Gustavo knew it. In private, he must have felt the inevitability. He had dodged too many raids, evaded too many traps. The law was patient. The law was relentless. And every day, the shadows grew smaller. The lion versus the law was never a fair fight. One man, no matter how brilliant, cannot outlast entire nations forever. But Gustavo fought it as long as he could, his calm pitted against their persistence. And for a time it worked. He survived. He adapted. He endured. But endurance has limits. And as the net closed tighter around Medellin, as Escobar dragged the cartel into open war with the state, Gustavo's silence could no longer protect him. The hunters were closing in, and when the law finally came, it would not come quietly. Hacienda Napoles rose from the Colombian countryside like a dream made solid. A sprawling estate, larger than some towns, with private lakes, horse tracks, swimming pools, sculptures, and even a private zoo stocked with exotic animals. To the poor in Medellin, it was proof of Pablo Escobar's power, a palace for a king who had grown from their streets. To journalists and politicians, it was a monument to arrogance, a criminal empire flaunting itself in broad daylight. But to Gustavo Gaviria, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder of the differences between him and his cousin. Pablo adored spectacle. He wanted the world to see his wealth, to marvel at it, to whisper about it in fear and awe. He filled Hacienda Napoles with giraffes, elephants, hippos, rare birds, animals that had no business in Colombia but made him feel like a ruler of kingdoms. He built fountains shaped like airplanes, a driveway with a replica of the first plane he used for smuggling, a private bull ring for entertainment. Every inch of the estate screamed Escobar's hunger for immortality. Gustavo, by contrast, walked the same grounds with a different perspective. He enjoyed the wealth, yes. He swam in the pools, watched the animals, sat at the long dining tables. But he never reveled in it the way Pablo did. To Gustavo, Hacienda Napoles wasn't triumph. It was exposure. It was evidence. It was a crown too shiny to be ignored by hunters. Still, the cousins shared many days on that estate. Families gathered. Children ran across manicured lawns. Wives and mistresses mingled uneasily under the gaze of armed guards. Music played at night. Laughter echoed across courtyards. For brief moments, it felt like paradise. And for men who had crawled up from the dusty streets of Pereira and Medellin, perhaps it was. They had built something unimaginable, and here, in the hills, they could breathe as kings. But even paradise carried shadows. The estate was surrounded by soldiers, cartel gunmen armed with rifles, patrolling night and day. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Watchtowers scanned the horizon. Every party, every family gathering, every game of soccer on those fields took place under the threat of raids, assassinations, betrayal. Children swam in pools, but just beyond the fences, men with rifles waited for the signal to kill. This was the contradiction of the Hacienda days. Luxury wrapped in violence. Celebration wrapped in fear. For Pablo, the contradictions didn't matter. He saw Hacienda Napoles as his legacy, proof that he was more than a trafficker. He wanted his name to be spoken in the same breath as kings and presidents. He wanted the estate to be remembered long after he was gone. Gustavo wanted something simpler. He enjoyed the comforts, but he stayed cautious. Even in moments of wealth, he thought about logistics, how to protect the estate, how to secure the money, how to keep shipments moving while Pablo entertained guests. For him, the hacienda was not an end. It was a distraction from the work that truly mattered. Cartel insiders noticed the difference. Pablo was flamboyant, bringing politicians, celebrities, even soccer stars to the estate. Gustavo was quieter, preferring smaller gatherings, family dinners, private conversations. Where Pablo used Hacienda Napoles as a stage, Gustavo used it as a retreat. He wasn't interested in impressing the world. He was interested in protecting the world he had built. And yet, even Gustavo couldn't escape the pull of luxury. The wealth they had amassed was staggering, and the hacienda gave it form. Children rode horses imported from Europe. Cars lined the garages, some custom-made, others stolen trophies. Even Gustavo, cautious as he was, allowed his family to enjoy what the empire had provided. Perhaps in private, he justified it as balance, a way to give meaning to the blood and risk that sustained them. But always, the war intruded. Meetings were held at the hacienda, cartel leaders gathering under chandeliers while gunmen stood outside. Plans were drawn, alliances forged, rivals discussed. Gustavo sat at those tables, calm as always, reminding men of costs, risks, strategies. Escobar would rage about enemies, slam his fist on the table, declare wars. Gustavo would counter with quiet warnings, subtle reminders, logical alternatives. Sometimes Pablo listened. More often, he didn't. The hacienda days also revealed the widening rift between the cousins' visions. Pablo reveled in his role as a Robin Hood figure, adored by the poor, feared by the state. He used the hacienda as proof of his myth. Gustavo saw the same estate and worried. Every giraffe, every helicopter, every lavish party was another spotlight, another reason for the government to act, another reason for the Americans to tighten their grip. To outsiders, it may have seemed that Gustavo enjoyed the hacienda as much as Pablo. But those who knew him said he never let himself believe in the illusion. He knew empires built on powder and blood were temporary. He knew palaces could become prisons. He knew Hacienda Napoles was not a symbol of permanence, but a target painted in concrete and marble. And indeed, it became one. In later years, after Escobar's death, the estate was seized, its animals abandoned, its grounds looted. What had once been paradise became a ghost of ambition, a ruin. Gustavo never lived to see that fall, but perhaps he anticipated it. Perhaps, as he walked those grounds, he knew the truth, that the hacienda was less a triumph and more warning. Still, in those moments, in the mid-1980s, the cousins lived as kings. The hacienda was alive with music, laughter, wealth, and shadows. Children ran barefoot across fields where lions roared in cages. Families ate meals under chandeliers while bodyguards watched for assassins in the dark. It was both dream and nightmare, a world that only men like Escobar and Gaviria could create. And for Gustavo, the Lion of Medellin, it was one more paradox to manage. A palace in the jungle, built on cocaine, defended with blood, and destined, like all empires, to crumble. Behind the roar of the Medellin Cartel, behind the billions of dollars, the smuggling routes, the gunmen, and the bombs, there was another Gustavo Gaviria, a man rarely glimpsed by the world, a man who lived in the quiet corners of his empire. Not the Lion of Medellin, feared by rivals and hunted by the DEA, but a husband, a father, a family man. It is easy to forget that even the architects of bloodshed sit at dinner tables. They kiss their children goodnight. They listen to the laughter of family gatherings. For all his ruthlessness in business, Gustavo carried a softer side into his home. Those who knew him privately described a man whose calm extended beyond boardrooms and safe houses, a man who seemed genuinely at peace in the company of his family. Unlike Pablo, who relished in playing the role of king both inside and outside his home, Gustavo separated his worlds. The empire was one life, family another. He built walls between them as carefully as he built smuggling routes. For him, The house was sanctuary, the one place where blood and powder did not define him. In Medellin's upscale neighborhoods, Gustavo lived quietly with his wife and children. Their homes, though well-guarded, were not ostentatious in the same way as Escobar's Hacienda Napoles. They were comfortable, luxurious, but discreet. Gustavo didn't want neighbors whispering about exotic animals or fountains shaped like airplanes. He wanted calm, invisibility, a sense of normalcy. At family gatherings, he was warm, affectionate, attentive. Children climbed onto his lap. He listened to their stories, encouraged their dreams. He gave gifts, not as bribes for loyalty, but as tokens of genuine care. To his children, he was not the cartel's financial wizard. He was their father, the man who tucked them in, who shielded them from the world outside, who reminded them of the value of family above all else. That devotion wasn't an act. Gustavo valued loyalty in all things, but nowhere more than in blood ties. Just as he had stood by Pablo out of family loyalty, he protected his own family with an almost obsessive vigilance. Security was tight. Guards patrolled the perimeters. Safe houses were always ready. Escape plans were rehearsed. To live in his world meant living under constant threat, and Gustavo did everything he could to shield his wife and children from it. Still, shadows cannot be fully banished. Children overheard whispers. Wives saw the fatigue in their husbands' eyes, the tension in their shoulders. Even when surrounded by love, Gustavo carried the weight of his empire into his home. He tried to hide it, but shadows cling. A phone call during dinner, a sudden departure in the middle of the night, bodyguards whispering about raids. All reminders that their sanctuary was built on fragile ground. What made Gustavo unique was the way he humanized himself in private. To his children, he was not untouchable. He showed them patience, humor, even vulnerability. He was known to sit quietly, listening to music, enjoying a drink, smiling at his family's laughter. In those moments, the lion was not a predator. He was simply a man who cherished the fragile peace of home. But peace never lasted long. Family trips required convoys of armed men. Birthday parties were watched over by sicarios with rifles hidden under jackets. Every hug, every laugh, was shadowed by the reality that their father was one of the most hunted men in Colombia. Gustavo accepted the contradiction, even if it haunted him. He once told a confidant that family was his reason for everything. The hustles, the risks, the empire. Without them, he said, none of this matters. It was both an admission of love and a confession of guilt, because he knew the empire that provided for his family also endangered them. Wealth bought them comfort, but it also painted a target on their backs. In contrast to Pablo's flamboyant fatherhood, Escobar once letting his children ride elephants at Hacienda Napoles, Gustavo's style was quieter. He wanted to shield rather than flaunt. His children were not paraded before cameras. His wife did not live in tabloids. The lion's family stayed in shadows, just as he did. Yet the contradictions could not be erased. His children knew their father was no ordinary businessman. They saw the guards, the weapons, the whispered meetings. They felt the fear in their mother's eyes when news of raids or assassination spread. They lived with the knowledge that their safety was always fragile. And Gustavo knew it too. For all his efforts to separate his worlds, they bled into each other. Rivals didn't care about boundaries. The state didn't care about sanctuaries. To be part of his family was to be part of his empire, whether they wanted it or not. This duality defined Gustavo in his final years. To the world, he was the invisible architect of the Medellin Cartel, the man who built routes, laundered billions, and kept Escobar's empire alive. To his family, he was a father, a husband, a protector. He carried both roles with the same calm, the same discipline, the same quiet authority. But beneath the surface, perhaps he wondered how long he could keep those roles from colliding. Because in Medellin, no sanctuary lasted forever. Bombs did not care about family dinners. Bullets did not pause for bedtime stories. The storm Escobar had unleashed raged everywhere, and even the lion's home was not beyond its reach. Still, Gustavo cherished those moments of peace. perhaps more than anything else. In the laughter of his children, in the warmth of family meals, he found balance. The calm counterpart not only to Pablo, but to himself, the man who could be ruthless architect one moment and gentle father the next. But the storm outside grew louder each day, and the shadows that Gustavo tried to keep from his family's door were creeping closer. Because in Medellin, even lions could not protect their dens forever. By 1989, the Medellin Cartel looked invincible from the outside. It controlled the flow of cocaine into the United States, funneled billions through secret accounts, commanded armies of sicarios, and bent politicians to its will. But inside, cracks had begun to spread through the foundation. Cracks that even Gustavo Gaviria's calm logic could not seal forever. The first crack came from abroad. The Americans were no longer stumbling in the dark. Years of busts, raids, and informants had given the DEA and U.S. Customs a clearer picture of the cartel's operations. Miami, once a free-flowing port of cocaine, had become hostile ground. Florida was swarming with task forces, helicopters, and Coast Guard cutters. Each intercepted boat, each seized plane, chipped away at profits. The cartel shifted routes, but adaptation meant more risk, more cost, and more exposure. The second crack came from within Colombia itself. Escobar's war with the state had reached terrifying new heights. Judges assassinated, politicians gunned down, car bombs detonated in crowded streets. It was a strategy of pure terror, and it made Escobar both untouchable and universally hated. For the poor, he remained a Robin Hood. For everyone else, he was a monster. The government, under mounting U.S. pressure, was forced to strike harder. Elite police units, heavily armed and trained with American support, stalked Medellin's neighborhoods. The war was no longer whispers and shadows. It was open battle. For Gustavo, each crack was a warning. He had built the empire on efficiency, invisibility, and discipline. But Pablo's war strategy ignored all three. The louder Escobar roared, the more enemies swarmed. Gustavo tried to balance it, to keep shipments moving, to keep money flowing, to maintain control. But even he knew the tide was turning. One of the most dangerous cracks came not from governments, but from rivals. The Cali cartel, Medellin's bitter enemy, thrived on Pablo's chaos. While Escobar bombed and assassinated, Cali bribed and infiltrated. Their leaders presented themselves as businessmen, quiet and diplomatic, cultivating favor with politicians and the media. Every violent headline tied to Medellin made Cali look cleaner, safer, more reasonable. And behind the scenes, Cali fed information to Colombian and U.S. authorities, pointing hunters toward Medellin's operations. Inside the cartel, paranoia spread. Informants were everywhere. Men whispered of betrayal, of leaks, of networks collapsing under pressure. Gustavo worked tirelessly to shore up defenses, rotating safe houses, rerouting money, shifting shipments. But even he could not silence the truth. The empire's unity was fraying. Allies questioned Escobar's war. Businessmen within the cartel wanted profit, not chaos. Sicarios grew restless as death surrounded them on all sides. Then came 1989's defining blow. Avianca Flight 203. Escobar ordered the bombing of a passenger plane, believing a presidential candidate who supported extradition was on board. The plane exploded midair, killing more than 100 innocent people. The world recoiled in horror. The Colombian state, already pressured by Washington, unleashed everything it had. And though Gustavo had not pushed for such an act, his silence bound him to it. The lion shared in the blame for the roar that followed. The cracks widened. The United States declared all-out war on Medellin. Colombia passed harsher extradition laws. International pressure mounted. Banks that once turned a blind eye began closing accounts. Offshore havens became less safe. Even the financial systems Gustavo had built so carefully were under siege. At home, the violence was unrelenting. Medellin streets ran with blood, not just from battles with the state, but from internal disputes. Traitors executed, rivals eliminated, informants silenced. The city lived in fear, and fear corrodes even loyalty. Families fled. Businesses closed. Medellin, once the proud capital of Escobar's empire, became synonymous with terror. And through it all, Gustavo watched with heavy eyes. He had built a machine meant to last, an empire meant to endure. But every day, the cracks spread further. He reminded Pablo that invisibility had been their greatest strength, that terror was unsustainable, that even lions cannot fight every hunter forever. But Pablo, consumed by pride and rage, refused to listen. In private moments, perhaps Gustavo allowed himself to imagine a different path, one where negotiations ended the war, where money secured their survival, where the cartel retreated into shadows instead of burning in the light. But imagination could not alter reality. The war was escalating, and the cracks were too many. By early 1990, the Medellin Cartel was still immensely powerful. Cocaine still flowed. Billions still poured in. But the cost of each dollar grew higher. More bribes, more blood, more risks. The empire no longer felt like an untouchable fortress. It felt like a dam swelling against unstoppable pressure. And Gustavo, the architect, must have known what comes when a dam breaks. For the first time, whispers spread, even inside the cartel. Could they survive this? Could Escobar's war be won? Could Gustavo's systems withstand the weight of the world pressing down? No one spoke the questions aloud to Pablo, but they lived in every uneasy glance, every hushed conversation, every sleepless night. The cracks in the empire were no longer invisible. They were everywhere, in the streets of Medellin, in the halls of government, in the accounts Gustavo fought to protect. And no matter how calm the lion remained, even he could not hold back the flood forever. Because empires built on powder and blood do not collapse all at once. They break slowly, painfully, crack by crack, until the whole structure finally falls. And by 1990, the fall of the Medellin Cartel was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. By 1990, the Medellin Cartel was still rich, still feared, still powerful. But its foundation was cracking, and at the center of the chaos stood Pablo Escobar, once a cunning kingpin, now a man consumed by rage and obsession. His empire had been built on ambition, but now it was collapsing under the weight of his pride. And beside him, watching the spiral with heavy eyes, stood Gustavo Gaviria. Escobar had always been bold. That boldness made him a legend, but legends can turn into curses. The war he unleashed on the Colombian state had grown beyond even his control. Car bombs thundered through Bogotá. Judges were executed in cold blood. Police officers were slaughtered in their hundreds. Medellin lived in daily fear, its streets soaked with blood. And Pablo reveled in it. He believed terror was power. He believed the louder he roared, the safer he became. But Gustavo knew better. He saw what Pablo refused to see, that the war was unsustainable. Violence may silence enemies, but it also multiplies them. Each assassination created new hunters. Each bombing gave the state more resolve. Escobar thought he was untouchable. Gustavo knew no man, no matter how rich, no matter how feared, could fight a nation forever. Their private conversations reflected the widening rift. Pablo raged about enemies, declaring he would rather die in Colombia than rot in a U.S. prison. Gustavo countered with logic, urging him to consider negotiations, to accept deals, to preserve the empire. He reminded his cousin that survival was victory, not spectacle. But Pablo wasn't listening anymore. He was too deep in his own myth, too convinced of his destiny. The downward spiral accelerated with the formation of Los Extraditables, the extraditables. Escobar and his allies declared open war on extradition, releasing communiques that promised death to anyone who supported sending traffickers to the United States. The slogan was simple: we prefer a grave in Colombia to a cell in the U.S. Gustavo understood the sentiment, but he also knew it was madness. Such defiance only guaranteed more blood, more pressure, more collapse. And collapse was coming. In November 1989, Escobar's men bombed the headquarters of the DS, Colombia's intelligence service, killing over 50 people. Weeks later, Avianca Flight 203 was blown out of the sky, killing more than 100 innocent passengers. These acts shocked the world, uniting Colombia and the United States in outrage. To Escobar, they were demonstrations of strength. To Gustavo, they were suicide notes written in fire. Still, loyalty bound him. Gustavo did not abandon his cousin. He continued to manage finances, move money, coordinate smuggling routes. Even as the empire bled, he kept its heart beating. He reminded associates that discipline still mattered, that the machine must keep running despite the chaos. But in his quiet moments, he must have known the truth. Pablo's spiral was dragging them all toward the abyss. The Colombian state, once crippled by corruption and fear, began fighting back harder. Elite police units, armed and trained with U.S. support, launched relentless raids. Informants whispered secrets for cash. Rivals in Cali fed intelligence to authorities, striking from the shadows while Medellin burned. For the first time, Escobar's name didn't inspire paralysis. It inspired determination to end him. Inside the cartel, tensions grew. Allies questioned Pablo's strategy. Businessmen who wanted profit whispered about negotiating. Families begged for peace. Even loyal sicarios grew weary of endless blood. But Escobar, consumed by pride, refused to bend. He had become a man at war not only with the state, but with reality itself. Gustavo stood at his side, but his role had changed. He was no longer the architect of expansion, the quiet genius building smuggling routes. He had become the voice of reason in a storm, pleading for restraint, arguing for deals, calculating ways to survive. But reason cannot calm a man drowning in his own myth. Escobar wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a warlord, and warlords do not compromise. And yet, Gustavo stayed loyal. Perhaps because of blood. Perhaps because of love. Perhaps because he believed, against all logic, that he could still steady the ship. But each passing month made survival less likely. Each bomb detonated. Each judge assassinated. Each headline about Escobar's atrocities made the walls close tighter. The spiral wasn't just political. It was personal. Escobar's paranoia grew. He trusted fewer men. He lashed out at rivals, suspected betrayal everywhere. Friends became enemies. Allies became targets. The empire, once so disciplined under Gustavo's quiet hand, was turning inward, devouring itself. By 1990, Medellin was no longer just a city under cartel control. It was a war zone. Entire neighborhoods were battlegrounds. Police convoys were ambushed. Journalists lived with death threats. Families lived with fear. And through it all, Escobar raged louder, while Gustavo remained silent, watching the storm consume everything they had built. The lie in silence was not weakness. It was grief. He had built an empire meant to endure. He had designed systems to outlast chaos. But no system can survive a leader intent on burning it down. Escobar was dragging their empire and their family into a war they could not win. And Gustavo must have known the end was near. Perhaps not the exact day, not the exact hour, but he felt it. The cracks were too deep, the spiral too steep. The empire they had built together was collapsing, and no amount of money, no number of smuggling routes, no clever laundering schemes could stop it. Still, he stayed, because loyalty, for Gustavo, was not negotiable. He had begun this journey with his cousin. He would end it with him, no matter the cost. But the cost was coming quickly. The hunt for Escobar was intensifying, and Gustavo, though quieter, though calmer, was just as marked. The Lion of Medellin had built the empire. Now the hunters wanted him as much as the king. And when the spiral reached its bottom, it would be Gustavo's turn to face the storm. By 1990, the Colombian state had stopped pretending. This was no longer a battle for politics, or reputation, or even law. It was survival. Pablo Escobar had declared war on his own country, and Colombia, backed by the United States, was fighting back with everything it had. But to dismantle the Medellin Cartel, they couldn't just go after the king. They needed to break the backbone. And that backbone was Gustavo Gaviria. For years, Gustavo had remained in the shadows, his name whispered only by insiders and investigators who studied the financial arteries of the cartel. Escobar was the lightning rod, the figure who drew every headline, every photograph, every roar of outrage. Gustavo was different, quiet, invisible, calculating. But by 1990, the investigators had caught on. They understood what every sicario, every accountant, every rival already knew. Escobar might be the face, but Gustavo was the mind. The DEA called him the financial brain. Colombian police called him the lion. And both knew that if the lion fell, the Medellin Cartel would lose its spine. The hunt for Gustavo began with intelligence, as all hunts do. Informants whispered about his movements, about the safe houses he used, about the men he trusted. Surveillance teams shadowed associates, tracked phone calls, intercepted messages. Every piece of information was fed into task forces determined to corner the cousin who had eluded them for so long. But hunting Gustavo was different from hunting Pablo. Escobar thrived on spectacle. He lived loudly, drawing attention to himself. Gustavo lived quietly, moving like smoke through Medellin's shadows. He rotated safe houses constantly, used layers of intermediaries, avoided public appearances. He never flaunted his wealth in the way Pablo did. He didn't buy mansions with gold-plated walls. He didn't drive luxury cars through crowded neighborhoods. His invisibility was a shield. And yet, even the best shields weaken under relentless fire. By mid-1990, the Colombian police, working with U.S. intelligence, had placed him under direct surveillance. They knew his patterns, his routines, his reliance on certain safe houses. The net was tightening. Inside the cartel, paranoia spread. Men whispered of betrayals, of leaks, of hunters drawing closer. Gustavo felt it too. He doubled security, reduced his movements, trusted fewer men. But even lions cannot remain unseen forever. The state had learned to look past Escobar's fire and focus on the shadow behind it. The hunt was not just about intelligence. It was also about strategy. Authorities knew Escobar was nearly untouchable, surrounded by layers of sicarios and entire neighborhoods loyal to him. But Gustavo, though cautious, was more accessible. He didn't command armies directly. He didn't surround himself with fanfare. His low profile made him harder to find, but also easier to isolate once found. To the police, killing Gustavo would achieve two goals. It would cripple the cartel's financial network, and it would wound Escobar in the one place he was vulnerable, his heart, because Pablo loved his cousin, trusted him completely. Without Gustavo, Escobar would be less a king and more a desperate warlord, raging without strategy, bleeding without a spine. For Gustavo, the hunt was suffocating. He knew he was marked. He knew every day could be his last. And yet, he remained calm, as he always had. He managed money, moved shipments, adjusted routes. He never abandoned his post. He believed, or perhaps hoped, that his discipline could outlast their pursuit, that if he stayed careful, stayed quiet, he could survive. But even the lion was not immune to fate. Informants betrayed locations. Surveillance teams closed in. Safe houses became traps. Every move tightened the noose. And though Gustavo slipped through raids again and again, he must have felt the inevitability pressing down. Pablo, for all his bravado, feared losing Gustavo more than losing money or soldiers. He told men that his cousin was irreplaceable, and he was right. Without the lion, the Medellin Cartel would stumble. Without his calm logic, Escobar's fire would consume itself. Gustavo wasn't just family. He was anchor, architect, and conscience all at once, which is why the state made him a priority. Kill Escobar's cousin, and the king would unravel. By August 1990, the hunt had narrowed to a single safe house in Medellin. Colombian police, backed by U.S. intelligence, prepared for the strike. They believed Gustavo was inside, guarded but vulnerable. It was their chance to break the backbone, their chance to silence the lion. For Gustavo, those final days must have been heavy. He had lived with pressure for years, but now the storm was directly at his door. Did he sense it coming? Did he know the walls were closing in? Did he whisper goodbyes to his family, knowing the hunt was reaching its end? History doesn't record those moments. It only records what followed. The lion had been hunted for years. Now, at last, the hunters were ready to strike. August 11th, 1990, the night the lion fell. In Medellin, violence was nothing new. The city lived with the sound of gunfire, the rumble of bombs, the cries of sirens. But on that night, the hunt for Gustavo Gaviria reached its climax. Colombian police, backed by intelligence from the DEA, had pinpointed his location, a safe house, tucked in a quiet neighborhood. For years, Gustavo had slipped through raids, moved like smoke through the city's veins. But this time, the hunters were waiting with precision, patience, and overwhelming force. The safe house was modest compared to Escobar's palaces. No fountains, no exotic animals, no walls gilded with wealth. Gustavo preferred discretion, and this house was exactly that: quiet, anonymous, invisible to the casual passerby. But invisibility doesn't protect against betrayal. Informants had whispered its location. Surveillance had confirmed the movements. And now, trucks full of armed police circled the block, engines cut, men waiting for the order to strike. Inside, Gustavo was calm. He had lived under siege for years. He knew the weight of raids, the chaos of gunfire. Perhaps he believed this would be like the others, a narrow escape through a back exit, another relocation to another house. He had always survived before, always slipped through the cracks. But cracks, once widened enough, swallow everything. The raid began with a crash. Doors splintered, windows shattered, boots thundered across the floors. Shouts filled the air, Spanish commands barking through the night. And then came the bullets. Gunfire ripped through the safe house, tearing into walls, furniture, and flesh. Witnesses would later describe it as a storm, an eruption of noise so deafening it drowned out thought. Gustavo, the man who had spent a lifetime in shadows, was now pinned under the blinding light of violence. There was no negotiation, no arrest, no chance to surrender. This was not a capture. It was an execution dressed as a raid. The bullets struck him in a hail. Reports say more than a dozen rounds tore into his body. Some accounts claim he was shot in the head, others in the chest, but all agree he didn't survive long. The lion of Medellin, the architect of an empire, the calm shadow behind Escobar's fire, lay lifeless on the floor of a modest Medellin safe house. For the police, it was a victory. For the Colombian state, it was proof that the hunt could succeed, that even the most elusive figures of the cartel could be brought down. For the DEA, it was a signal to Washington. The war was being won. Gustavo Gaviria, the brain behind Escobar, was dead. But for Pablo, it was devastation. News of Gustavo's death reached Escobar quickly. Some say he wept openly, more than he ever did for any soldier, any ally, even some family. Others claim he erupted in fury, vowing revenge, vowing to make the state bleed for killing his cousin. Perhaps both are true. Gustavo was more than blood. He was anchor, partner, strategist, conscience. Without him, Escobar was unmoored, a storm without balance. And Medellin felt a shift. Within days, rumors spread across the city. The lion had fallen. Fear rippled through the cartel's ranks. If Gustavo could be killed, no one was untouchable. Sicarios whispered about betrayal. Accountants feared exposure. The foundation Gustavo had built with discipline and calm was gone, and cracks widened into fractures. Authorities, triumphant, paraded the news. Gustavo's death was hailed as a critical blow to the Medellin Cartel. Newspapers splashed headlines across front pages. Politicians declared progress in the war on drugs. For a moment, the state felt stronger than the shadows. But shadows don't die so easily. Escobar's rage fueled retaliation. Within weeks, more killings, more bombs, more blood. Gustavo's death hadn't ended the war. It had poured gasoline on it. Escobar was no longer guided by calm logic. He was driven by grief and fury. And grief and fury are uncontrollable. Yet for all the chaos that followed, something had undeniably shifted. Gustavo Gaviria's absence left a void no one could fill. He had been the mind behind the machine, the architect of smuggling routes, the master of laundering billions, the calm counterpart to Escobar's rage. Without him, the cartel still had power, still had money, still had soldiers. But it no longer had balance. August 11th, 1990. The night the lion was silenced. His death was more than the end of a man. It was the beginning of the end of an empire. The news spread like wildfire through Medellin. Gustavo Gaviria was dead, shot down in a hail of bullets inside a modest safe house. The cousin, the strategist, the lion. For the state, it was victory. For the DEA, it was proof the hunt was working. But for Pablo Escobar, it was devastation, the kind that money, power, or blood could never heal. Escobar had lost men before. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Sicarios sacrificed in battles with police. Allies executed by rivals. Politicians, judges, journalists murdered in his war against extradition. Each death was part of the cost of power, and Pablo accepted it. He grieved in his own way, sometimes with rage, sometimes with silence, but always moving forward. Gustavo was different. Gustavo was irreplaceable. When the news reached him, Escobar is said to have broken down in tears. Men who had never seen him show weakness swore they watched him cry like a child, his body shaking with grief. Others said his fury was uncontrollable, that he swore vengeance against the police, against the government, against anyone who had dared touch his cousin. Perhaps both accounts are true, because grief often comes in waves. One moment drowning in sorrow, the next consumed by rage. To Pablo, Gustavo wasn't just family. He was his other half, the one man he trusted without hesitation, the one who balanced his fire with calm, his recklessness with logic. Escobar was the face of the empire, but Gustavo was the mind. Without him, the empire felt like a body without a spine. In the days that followed, Escobar became erratic. Associates whispered that he looked hollow, his eyes dark, his temper short. He lashed out at enemies with greater violence than ever, ordering assassinations, planting bombs, unleashing terror. But the violence was not strategy anymore. It was grief turned outward, fury without calculation. Gustavo had always been the one to temper his cousin's rage. Without him, no one could stop the spiral. Pablo's grief was not confined to rage. In private, he mourned deeply. He spoke of Gustavo often, telling family and close allies that his cousin had been more than a partner. He had been his anchor. Some claimed he admitted that he loved Gustavo more than he loved anyone outside his immediate family. In a world where trust was fragile, where betrayal lurked behind every smile, Gustavo had been the one constant. And now he was gone. The cartel felt the loss too. Accountants, traffickers, and sicarios alike understood that Gustavo had been the architect of order. He kept money flowing, routes secure, logistics precise. Without him, everything felt looser, riskier, more unstable. Escobar, blinded by grief, pushed harder, demanded more, ignored advice. The calm counterpart was gone, and the storm raged unchecked. Authorities noticed a shift. Colombian police reported that Escobar became less predictable after Gustavo's death. His strategies grew reckless. His violence became less targeted, more desperate. DEA agents noted that Medellin's financial networks began to falter. Money was still pouring in, but without Gustavo's careful systems, laundering became sloppier, easier to trace. The death of one man had weakened the empire more than a dozen raids ever could. For Escobar personally, Gustavo's death was a wound that never closed. He was said to visit his cousin's grave in secret, guarded by men, tears in his eyes. He would speak to the headstone as if Gustavo could still hear him, promising vengeance, promising that their dream would not die. But dreams built on blood rarely survive grief. In many ways, Gustavo's death marked the beginning of Pablo's unraveling. He had always been dangerous, always ruthless, but Gustavo had been his anchor to logic. Without him, Pablo drifted into pure chaos. He trusted fewer men, isolated himself, clung to his family while lashing out at the world. Grief turned him harder, sharper, but also more vulnerable. He was no longer a man with a partner. He was a king alone, haunted by loss. The lion's death left more than a void in the cartel. It left a void in Pablo Escobar's soul. For all his power, all his wealth, Escobar was still human. And humans bleed when the ones they love are torn away. Medellin felt the shift. The violence escalated, but felt different now. Less calculated, more desperate. Escobar was roaring louder than ever, but the roar no longer sounded like triumph. It sounded like grief. And grief, in the end, is the one enemy no man can kill. After August 1990, the Medellin Cartel was never the same. The death of Gustavo Gaviria didn't just silence a man. It ripped out the brain of an empire. The lion, the architect, the quiet strategist who balanced chaos with order, was gone. And without him, Pablo Escobar's empire stumbled into madness. For years, Gustavo had been the one who kept the machine steady. He had built the smuggling routes, designed the laundering systems, managed the finances, and tempered his cousin's fury with logic. He had been the voice of restraint, the calm counterpart, the invisible architect. With him gone, the cartel still had billions, still had armies, still had power, but it no longer had balance. Escobar was devastated. His grief turned into rage, and rage turned into recklessness. He unleashed more violence than ever. Bombings, assassinations, kidnappings. But violence without calculation is like fire without control. It burns everything, even the hand that wields it. Gustavo had always measured the cost of violence, calculating whether each death brought profit or loss. Pablo no longer cared about cost. He wanted blood, vengeance, chaos. Inside the cartel, cracks widened into fractures. Accountants who once answered to Gustavo now struggled under Escobar's unpredictable demands. Smuggling routes became less efficient. Shipments were lost, not because authorities had grown stronger, but because the cartel systems were breaking down. Money was still flowing, but laundering became sloppy, easier to trace. The machine was no longer precise. It was staggering forward on brute force alone. Allies noticed the change. Men who once respected Medellin's efficiency began to doubt its strength. Rivals in Cali took advantage, presenting themselves as the disciplined alternative. While Medellin roared and burned, Cali bribed quietly, infiltrated silently, expanded steadily. The balance of power in Colombia's underworld was shifting, and Gustavo's absence made the shift faster. Even within Medellin, loyalty wavered. Sicarios who once followed orders with certainty now hesitated. Without the lion's calm leadership, orders felt chaotic, contradictory, suicidal. Some turned informant, feeding intelligence to the police. Others defected to Cali, seeking survival. Every betrayal, every leak, weakened Escobar further. The Colombian state, emboldened by Gustavo's death, struck harder. Police units launched raids daily, targeting safe houses, arresting associates, seizing assets. The DEA, too, pressed its advantage, tracing money trails that Gustavo once disguised so well. Escobar responded with bombs, but bombs could not fix collapsing systems. Every explosion brought more retaliation, more pressure, more isolation. For Pablo personally, the loss of Gustavo was like losing his compass. He trusted no one as deeply. He leaned heavily on family, but none of them had Gustavo's discipline or vision. Associates whispered that Escobar seemed less focused, more emotional. His decisions were driven by grief and paranoia, not strategy. The empire was still powerful, but its king was faltering. Historians would later say that Gustavo's death marked the turning point. Until then, the Medellin Cartel had seemed unstoppable, its power boundless, its wealth unimaginable. But empires collapse not only from outside attacks, but from within. Gustavo had been the glue holding chaos together. Without him, Escobar's empire became just that, chaos. And chaos cannot last forever. The empire without its brain lurched forward, still rich, still feared, but increasingly unstable. The DEA described Medellin after 1990 as a wounded beast, dangerous, unpredictable, but bleeding. Colombian police said the cartel's operations became easier to track. Even the streets of Medellin felt different. The aura of invincibility had faded. People whispered not only of Escobar's terror, but of his decline. Escobar himself seemed to know it. In moments of rare honesty, he admitted that losing Gustavo had broken something inside him. He had lost not just a cousin, but the one man who could tell him no and make him listen. The one man who could calculate risk while he dreamed of glory. Without that counterweight, he was free, and freedom, for Escobar, meant destruction. The lion's death was more than family tragedy. It was structural collapse. The Medellin Cartel didn't fall in one day, or one raid, or one bullet. It began to fall the moment its architect was gone. And yet, for a time, Escobar roared louder than ever. His grief fueled fury. His empire still had billions. His armies still killed without hesitation. But the roar was hollow, and every hunter in Colombia could hear it. Because an empire without its brain is still dangerous, but it is no longer immortal. The countdown to Medellin's end had begun. History remembers faces, not shadows. It remembers Pablo Escobar, the man who filled headlines, who terrorized nations, who declared himself untouchable. His image endures in photographs, films, myths. But if Escobar was the face of the Medellin Cartel, then Gustavo Gaviria was its mind. The lion of Medellin. The architect who built an empire in silence and died in silence. Even now, his legacy is hard to measure because Gustavo never sought credit. He left no speeches, no flamboyant estates, no statues. What he left was structure, the hidden gears of an empire that moved cocaine across oceans, laundered billions through banks, and turned Medellin from a city in the Andes into the capital of a global underworld. The DEA called him the financial brain. To allies, he was the calm counterpart. To Escobar, he was more blood, trust, conscience, balance. It is telling that Escobar, who trusted almost no one, trusted Gustavo completely. Others could betray. Others could fall. Gustavo remained. Until the night he didn't. His death in August 1990 was more than the loss of a man. It was the collapse of a foundation. The Medellin Cartel stumbled forward for years after, but never with the same discipline, never with the same precision. Escobar roared louder, but the roar was hollow. Without the lion, the empire was only noise. To understand Gustavo's legacy, you have to look past the blood and the billions. He was not just a trafficker. He was an innovator. He transformed cocaine trafficking from scattered smuggling into a multinational system. He pioneered laundering methods that banks and governments struggled to untangle even decades later. He treated crime like business, built empires like corporations. In another world, another time, perhaps his genius would have built legitimate fortunes. But in Colombia's reality, his genius fueled bloodshed. That contradiction defines his legacy. On one hand, he was a devoted family man, remembered by relatives as calm, protective, even loving. On the other, he was a man who signed death orders with the same detachment he used to balance accounts. He shielded his children with one hand while flooding foreign streets with cocaine using the other. He built homes with cartel money while Medellin bled under cartel bombs. The line was not simple. He was not only villain or only victim of circumstance. He was both. A man of warmth in private, a man of calculation in business, a man whose silence was as dangerous as Escobar's rage. And perhaps that is why his story lingers in shadows. Escobar draws the spotlight because his fire burned so loudly. Gustavo lingers because his influence was quieter, but no less profound. He did not roar, yet the empire roared because of him. When authorities celebrated his death, they called it victory. They said the backbone of Medellin had been broken, and in a way, they were right. But they also revealed something deeper. Gustavo was the true architect. Killing him hurt more than seizing shipments or arresting sicarios. It proved what many inside the cartel already knew, that Escobar might have been king, but Gustavo was the throne on which he sat. In Medellin, memories of him are complex. Some remember the family man, the quiet presence at gatherings, the father who tried to shield his children. Others remember the cartel's silent killer, the man whose calm disguised ruthless calculation. Both are true. Both are part of his legacy, and his cousin never recovered. Escobar without Gustavo was a storm without anchor, a warlord without restraint. He raged louder, killed more, drew more attention. But without the lion, his empire was doomed. In the end, Escobar died hunted on a Medellin rooftop, surrounded by soldiers. Some say in that moment, even he must have felt the absence of the cousin who had always steadied him. What then is Gustavo Gaviria's legacy? It is the reminder that empires are not built by faces alone. They are built by minds in the shadows, by architects whose work remains invisible until it collapses. Gustavo was one of those architects. His genius built a criminal machine that changed history. His silence made him dangerous. His death proved how fragile even the strongest empires become when the brain is removed. And yet, like all men of power, his legacy is also cautionary. The wealth, the systems, the brilliance, none saved him. Shadows only protect for so long. Eventually, light finds every figure, even those who never sought it. In the end, the Lion of Medellin died, not in glory, not in spectacle, but in a hail of bullets inside an anonymous safe house. No crown, no speech, no legacy carved in stone, just silence. But history remembers. It remembers that behind Escobar's fire, there was calm. Behind Escobar's chaos, there was discipline. Behind Escobar's myth, there was Gustavo Gaviria, the lion who never roared, yet whose silence built an empire that shook the world.